What if the only thing standing between you and total ruin was a stranger's lie? Eleanor Cross walked into that ranch with nothing but a needle, a spool of thread, and her last dollar. She wasn't looking for love. She wasn't looking for trouble. But when a drunk man grabbed her in front of 100 strangers and called her something she wasn't, one man stepped forward and called her something she never expected. "Everybody, I'd like you to meet my wife." 5 words, one beautiful lie, and 2 broken people who made a deal that was strictly business, until it wasn't. Welcome to this channel, where we tell stories of the rugged West. Cowboys and their codes, love born in dust and hardship, the tender bond between mother and child, and the quiet grace of human kindness when the world turns cold. This story reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't drawing a gun. It's opening your heart when everything inside you says to run. If that kind of courage speaks to you, hit like, drop your city in the comments. I'm curious just how far this story travels. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.
That November wind smelled like snow and burning wood as it whipped across the Wyoming plains, cutting right through Elena Cross's old wool coat, while the stagecoach bounced its way to the Hartwell Ranch. She clutched the leather bag on her lap, the one that held every last thing she owned in the world: 3 sewing needles, a spool of black thread, her mama's thimble, and a letter from Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell hiring her as a seamstress for the winter. It was meant to be straightforward work. A little mending, some tailoring, and maybe making a few new dresses for the lady of the ranch. It would be just enough to send some money back home to her little sister in Denver, enough to stop the bank from taking their childhood home, and enough to finally prove that Elena Cross was more than just the daughter of a man who drank his life away and left a pile of debt behind. The coach driver reined in the horses at the head of a long gravel path. Through the dirty glass, Elena laid eyes on it. The Hartwell Ranch spread out across the valley like something from a picture book. The main house was 3 stories high, made of a golden stone that just soaked up the afternoon light. Bright white paint shined on the porches that wrapped all the way around. Barns and stables fanned out behind the house, and way off in the distance, cattle looked like tiny specks on the hills. This was real wealth, real power, the kind of life Elena had only ever seen through a storefront window. "This is it for you, miss," the driver hollered down, his words turning to smoke in the frigid air. Elena got down from the coach, her tired old boots crunching on the gravel. She pulled her coat straight, pushed a stray piece of dark hair from her face, and lifted her chin high. She had learned a long time ago that acting confident could cover up a lot of problems, even when your dress was patched 6 ways from Sunday, and all you had eaten was yesterday's stale bread. She walked up to the big front door and lifted her hand to knock, but it swung open before she even touched it. A butler filled the doorway, his face like a stone wall. Past him, the entryway was lit up like high noon, with crystal chandeliers and shiny floors that glowed. You could hear music and people laughing from deep inside that big house. "Service entrance is around back," the butler said, already starting to shut the door on her. "I am not a delivery," Elena said, her words rushing out. "My name is Elena Cross. Mrs. Hartwell hired me. I am the seamstress." The butler's eyes drifted down over her worn-out coat and muddy boots, staying there just long enough to make her cheeks burn with shame. "Mrs. Hartwell is not available. There is a very important gathering here this evening. Come back in the morning. But I have been traveling for 2 days to get here," the letter said. "In the morning." And with that, the door closed with a soft, final click. Elena was left standing on the porch all by herself, fighting to catch her breath. The money she had for a ticket home was gone, spent on food she couldn't dare go without. She had $4 to her name. That was not enough for a room. It was not enough for anything at all. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to fight off the rising tide of fear. That is when she heard it. A woman's voice, clear and strong, cutting right through the chilly night air. "That is enough of that, Thomas. If Mrs. Hartwell sent for the girl, then she is expected. Let her in this house before she turns into an icicle. The door opened up again. A woman in her 60s stood in the doorway, wearing a deep purple silk dress with her silver hair pinned up perfectly. Her eyes were sharp but had a touch of kindness, and she looked Elena over like someone who knew how to size a person up in a hurry. "You must be Miss Cross," the woman said. "I am Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell. Pay no mind to Thomas. He gets a little carried away when we have company. Come on in, child, before you catch your death of cold." Elena walked into a warmth so wonderful it felt like a dream. The entry hall was even grander up close. It had carved wood walls, fancy oil paintings, and gold frames. A huge staircase swept upwards in a beautiful curve. And there were people everywhere, men in sharp suits and women in dresses that cost more than Elena would make in a whole year, walking around with glasses of champagne, with jewels sparkling on their necks and arms. The whole room buzzed with money and comfort, the kind of feeling that comes when you have never had to wonder where your next meal is coming from. Elena could feel every single person turn to look at her. She felt them judging her shabby coat, the mended dress she wore underneath, and the dust covering her boots. "Please forgive all this commotion," Mrs. Hartwell said, leading Elena to a less crowded spot. "My son's engagement party got started about an hour ago. I did not realize you were set to arrive today, or I would have had everything properly ready for you." "Engagement?" Elena felt her stomach drop. "Oh, I am so sorry. I did not mean to interrupt. The letter said the 15th of November. "And today is the 15th of November, Mrs. Hartwell said with a tired little smile. "I am the one who ought to be apologizing. I have been running 2 homes, planning this circus of a party, and it seems I have lost track of my own letters." She gave Elena's arm a gentle squeeze. "But you are here now, and I am not about to send you back out into that cold. Come on, we have a room all ready for you upstairs. You can get some rest. I will have a plate of food sent up, and we can talk about the work tomorrow morning." Relief washed over Elena so strong she thought her knees might just give out. "Thank you. I truly mean that." Mrs. Hartwell started to lead her to the grand staircase, but they had only made it up 3 steps when a man's loud voice echoed through the hall. "Adelaide, there you are. We have been searching all over for you." A stout man in a fancy suit walked right up to them, his face red from too much champagne and a big sense of his own importance. Trailing behind him was a woman covered in diamonds and a young couple who looked completely bored. "Senator Morrison," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice smooth and practiced. "I was just seeing to something." "We are looking for Caleb," the senator cut her off. "He has vanished again, and the Fairfax family wants to make the official announcement." It is hard to have an engagement party when the groom is missing, is it not? The smile on Mrs. Hartwell's face got a little bit tighter. "I am sure he just went outside for a moment. You know my son is not fond of big crowds." "Well, he had better start getting fond of them soon," Morrison said with a laugh that had no joy in it. "This marriage is a big deal for both our families, for the future of this whole territory." His eyes then fell on Elena, and he dismissed her in a single glance. "Who is this?" "She is a guest," Mrs. Hartwell stated plainly. "She does not look like any guest I have ever laid eyes on." Morrison's gaze ran over Elena's worn clothes with pure scorn. "Then again, I suppose Caleb has always had some strange tastes." The insult hit Elena like a physical blow. She felt her face get hot, but she kept her expression calm and her chin up. She had been through a whole lot worse than some drunk man's rude comment. "If you two will excuse us," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice turning to ice. "I was just taking Miss Cross up to her room." But Morrison was not listening anymore. He had already turned back to the party with his group following him. "Find your son, Adelaide, before Victor Fairfax runs out of patience." Mrs. Hartwell waited until they were far enough away before she let out a long, slow breath. "Bless his heart, that man is a piece of work," she whispered, and then spoke louder. "Come along, my dear. Let us get you to your room before someone else decides to be impolite." They went up to the second floor, where the noise from the party softened to a low hum. The hallway was long and peaceful, with lamps on the wall casting warm circles of light on the thick rug. Mrs. Hartwell stopped at a door near the far end. "This room will be yours," she said, pushing it open to show a space. The sight of it all just made Elena's throat close up. There was a big four-poster bed with a quilted cover, a washstand that had a real mirror, and a window that looked out over the whole valley. The last bit of daylight was painting the hills with shades of amber and rose. "It is just beautiful," Elena whispered. "I will have some supper brought up to you. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow we can talk about your work properly." Mrs. Hartwell stopped at the door and her face softened just a bit. "And Miss Cross, do not let men like Morrison make you feel small. You are worth 10 of them, fancy coat or not." The door clicked shut, leaving Elena all by herself in more luxury than she had ever known. She put down her little bag, ran a hand over the smooth coverlet, and just let herself be weak for 1 second. She sat down on the bed's edge and let the tears fall. They were tears of relief, of pure exhaustion, and of that deep-down fear that had been her shadow for months finally letting go. She was safe. At least for tonight, she was safe. Someone knocked about an hour later. Elena had already washed her face and put on her only other dress. It was a dark blue cotton, patched up carefully but clean. She opened the door, thinking it would be a maid with her supper. But it was a young woman in a sage-green dress. Her blonde hair was curled perfectly, and she had a sharp, curious look on her face. "So you are the seamstress," the woman said, looking Elena over from head to toe. "I am Beatrice Morrison, the senator's daughter." She did not bother waiting for an invitation, just swept right into the room like someone who had never been told no in her life. "Mother sent me to tell you that supper is going to be late. The kitchen is just swamped with the party." Her smile was nothing but teeth. "Of course you could come on down and join the party. There is plenty of food to go around." It was a challenge. Elena knew it right away. It was the same kind of challenge she had faced 100 times back in the poor part of Denver, when girls from good families wanted to see her make a fool of herself. "That is very kind," Elena said, choosing her words with care. "But I would not want to get in the way of a private party." "Oh, it is not all that private," Beatrice said. "Seems like half the territory is here. One more person would not make a bit of difference." She walked over to the window, letting her fingers trail on the sill. "Though I suppose you might feel a little out of place. These kinds of get-togethers can be a bit much if you are not used to them." And there it was, that mean little jab wrapped up in fake kindness. "I do appreciate the invitation," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, "but I am just plumb tired from my trip." Beatrice turned around, her face full of calculation. "Have it your way. But you ought to know there is some chatter downstairs about Mrs. Hartwell bringing in a strange woman during her son's engagement party. Some folks are saying it is disrespectful to the Fairfax family." She started for the door, then stopped right on the edge of it. "I just thought you would want to know what people are thinking." She was gone before Elena could say a word, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Elena shut the door and leaned her back against it, her heart just hammering in her chest. She should have known. She should have figured that showing up tonight looking like she did would start some talk. Rich folks always found somebody to whisper about, somebody to look down on. She went to the window and pressed her forehead to the cool glass. Down below, guests were spilling out onto the back terrace, their laughter floating up on the night air. Lanterns were hanging from the tree limbs, making shadows dance all over the perfect gardens. A string quartet was playing somewhere, and the music mixed with all the talking and the clinking of glasses. It was beautiful. It was also a world where she would never fit in. She was just about to turn away when she spotted him. A man was standing all by himself at the edge of the terrace, half hidden by the shadows. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and he stood so stiff with tension. Even from way up here, Elena could tell he did not belong with all the easy laughter of the party. He stood there like a man who was just putting up with something, not celebrating. His dark suit somehow made him look even more alone instead of a part of the crowd. As she watched, a woman in a big pink gown went up to him, reaching for his arm. He took a step back and shook his head. The woman kept at it, her hands moving more and more. Finally, he just turned and walked away from the whole party, disappearing into the darkness past the lantern light. Elena had to wonder if that was Caleb Hartwell, the groom who kept wandering off from his own engagement party. But even though she was bone-tired, sleep just would not come. Elena laid there in that strange bed, listening to the party going on downstairs, and tried not to think about tomorrow. She tried not to think about the job she was hired to do, or about whether Mrs. Hartwell would be sorry she brought her here once she saw how people were reacting to her. Around midnight, her stomach was growling loud enough to echo in the big, quiet room, so Elena gave up on trying to sleep. She lit the little lamp by the bed and decided to try her luck downstairs. Not to the party, she would never do that. But maybe she could find the kitchen. She hoped she could get a piece of bread or some cheese without being a bother to anyone. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders and slipped out into the hall. The house was a bit quieter now, though she could still hear music and voices drifting up from downstairs. She found a set of servants' stairs and went down them carefully, following the smell of roasted meat and fresh-baked bread. The kitchen was warm and bright, and empty except for a young woman washing dishes in a big stone sink. The girl looked up when Elena came in, and her face was a little suspicious. "I'm so sorry to bother you," Elena said in a rush. "I'm staying upstairs, and I missed out on supper. I was just hoping I might find a little something to eat. I do not want to be any trouble." The girl's face softened up. "You are the seamstress, are you not, Miss Cross?" When Elena nodded, the girl smiled. "I am Mary. Mrs. Hartwell told us all to look after you." She dried her hands on her apron. "You sit right down. I will fix you up a real plate." Elena tried to say no, but Mary was already moving, getting out cold chicken, fresh bread, butter, and a big slice of cheese. She put it all on the wooden table with a glass of milk. "Thank you," Elena said, and she truly meant it. "You have to eat," Mary said, real firm. "You look like you are half-starved." She went back to her dishes, then said over her shoulder, "Do not you pay any mind to those fancy folks upstairs. They are always like this when there is a big to-do, all full of themselves and their opinions." Elena took a bite of the bread, and it was so good she almost cried out. Real butter, bread fresh from the oven. When was the last time she had eaten anything that was not 3 days old? "I met Miss Morrison," Elena said between bites. "She seemed worried about me being here." Mary just snorted. "Beatrice Morrison is worried about anything that might get in her way. She has had her sights set on Mr. Caleb for years, but he never paid her any mind." She lowered her voice like she was telling a big secret. "Truth is, nobody saw this engagement to Miss Fairfax coming either. It just happened out of the blue about 6 weeks ago. The rumor is that it is all about politics. Her father and Senator Morrison have some business deals together, and they want the Hartwell land and influence as part of their plans." Elena knew she should not ask. It was none of her business, but she could not help herself. "And Mr. Hartwell, what does he want?" Mary's face turned serious. "Now, that is the real question, is it not? He is a good man, Miss Cross. He is fair with his workers and honest in his business. But he is also a private man. He keeps his feelings locked up good and tight." She shook her head. "All I know is he has not cracked a smile one time since this engagement was announced. And tonight, at his own party, he looks like a man being led to the gallows." The picture of that lonely man at the edge of the terrace popped back into Elena's head, his stiff shoulders, the way he pulled back from that woman in pink like her touch was a hot iron. "That is just sad," Elena said softly. "That is just how life is for folks like us," Mary answered. "We do not always get to choose. We do what we have to do to get by." She pointed at Elena's plate, which was almost empty. "Have some more." "No, thank you. This was just perfect." Elena stood up and took her plate to the sink. "Let me help you finish up." "Absolutely not," Mary said, shooing her away with her hands. "You are a guest. You go on back to bed. Tomorrow is going to get here soon enough." Elena thanked her one more time and headed back toward the servants' stairs. But as she started to climb, she heard voices coming from somewhere close by. They were raised and angry, and they made her stop in her tracks. "I absolutely insist, Caleb. You have been hiding all evening." I was not hiding, Mother. I was just trying to get a breath of fresh air." Elena froze right where she stood. She knew she ought to turn around, climb those stairs, and stay out of business that was not hers. But there was something in that man's voice, a deep, raw weariness under the words, that held her feet to the floor. "This is important," Mrs. Hartwell said, her own voice tight with strain. "The Fairfaxes expect us to be proper hosts. Margaret has been asking for you." "Margaret does not want to find me any more than I want her to." She heard his boots pacing back and forth on the hardwood. "This whole arrangement is a complete sham, and you know it. What I know is that you gave your word on this engagement. I gave my word to protect this ranch from Morrison's political games. That does not mean I have to act like I am happy about it." A heavy silence fell between them. When Mrs. Hartwell spoke again, her voice was softer. "Caleb, son, I know this is not what you wanted, but sometimes we have to—" "What?" "Do what is necessary." His laugh had no joy in it. "I am well aware. I have been doing what is necessary for my entire life. Tonight is just one more show to put on. If you would just give Margaret a chance." "I have given her every chance. She is a perfectly fine woman who deserves a man that can truly love her. And that man is not me." His voice got lower, thick with a feeling that sounded a lot like grief. "I will not do that to another woman, Mother. I will not pretend I can give something I no longer have." Elena's heart clenched. She did not know this man's story. She did not know what had carved that emptiness into his voice. But she knew the sound of it. It was the same sound she had heard in her own voice after her daddy passed, after the bills started piling up, after she figured out that wishing for a different life does not make it so. "Then what are you going to do?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The same thing I always do. Get through the night, wake up for tomorrow, and just keep going." Elena turned and walked up the stairs without a sound, her heart aching for a man she had never even met. She understood that way of thinking all too well, the simple art of just enduring, of putting one foot in front of the other when you cannot even see the trail ahead. She should have gone right to her room, locked the door, and crawled into bed, staying far, far away from the storm brewing in the Hartwell house. But Elena had always been a little too curious for her own good. Instead of going up to the second floor, she felt a pull toward the sounds of the party, not to join in, never that, but just to see, to try and understand the world she had accidentally walked into. She found a little nook just off the main hall, half hidden behind a big potted fern, where she could watch without being seen. The ballroom spread out before her, a sea of golden light and twirling dresses, with crystal chandeliers throwing rainbows all over the polished floors. Right in the middle of it all stood a young woman in a fancy white gown. That must be Miss Fairfax, pretty in that fragile china doll sort of way, with pale blonde hair and a smile that looked like she had practiced it. She was holding court with a circle of guests, laughing at something Senator Morrison said, her hand resting on a man's arm like she owned him. Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was the man from the terrace, Caleb Hartwell. Up close, even from across the room, he was something to look at. Not handsome in the way you see in pictures. His features were too sharp for that. His jaw was too square, his dark eyes held too many shadows. But you could not look away. He was a good head taller than most men there. His black suit fit perfectly over his broad shoulders. His dark hair was combed neat, but it looked like it wanted to be wild, and his face was the picture of misery. He looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the whole world. Margaret Fairfax said something, leaning in close, and he gave a polite nod, but his eyes were a million miles away, and he stood as stiff as a board. When she reached up to fix his collar, a familiar gesture that staked her claim. Elena saw his jaw tighten, saw him fight the urge to pull back. Poor bastard, looks like he would rather be wrangling cattle in a dust storm. Elena jumped and turned to find a man leaning against the wall right beside her little hiding spot. He was younger than Caleb, maybe 25, with a friendly smile and eyes that were sharper than his relaxed posture let on. "I did not mean to snoop," Elena said in a hurry. "Neither did I," the man said with a grin. "But here we are, the both of us, hiding in the shadows while the whole place goes up in flames." He held out his hand. James Hartwell, the less impressive younger brother. Elena Cross. She shook his hand, feeling the calluses that told her he was not just some rich man's son who only pretended to work. "Ah," James said. "The mysterious seamstress everyone's been whispering about. Beatrice Morrison has been spinning tales about you for the last hour. She figures you are either a long-lost cousin, an old flame, or a spy from a rival ranch." A small smile touched Elena's lips despite herself. "I am none of those things. I am just a woman who needs a job." "Well then, you have definitely crashed the wrong party," James said, his eyes drifting back to the ballroom. "This whole affair is a train wreck just waiting to happen. My brother looks like he is about to make a run for it. Margaret looks like she is putting on a play for a crowd, and Senator Morrison is about 3 drinks away from starting a fight with anyone who questions his plans for the territory." "Why did he say yes to it?" Elena asked. "Mr. Caleb, I mean, if he is this miserable." James's smile faded. "Because my brother has spent his whole life doing what he thinks is right instead of what he actually wants. Our father built this ranch up from nothing, and when he passed, Caleb took it all on. The land, the loans, the well-being of every single person who works here. Morrison has been trying for years to get his hands on our water rights and grazing land for his railroad. A partnership with the Fairfax family gives Caleb some political cover." He shook his head. "But it is costing him his freedom, his life, and any shot he has at being truly happy." Elena felt that familiar tightness in her chest, the kind of understanding that comes from living the same hard truth. Sometimes just getting by does not leave any room for being happy. "No," James agreed quietly. "But that does not mean we ever stop wanting it." They stood there for a moment in a comfortable silence, watching the show play out. Then, across the ballroom, Elena saw a man stumbling through the crowd. He was older, with a red face, and clearly had too much to drink. He was heading straight for Caleb and Margaret, and the look on his face spelled trouble. "Who is that?" she asked. James swore under his breath. "Victor Fairfax, Margaret's father, and he looks like he's about to fall over." He stood up straighter. "This is not going to end pretty." It did not. Victor Fairfax got to the couple and grabbed Caleb's arm with more force than friendliness. "Here's the groom," he shouted for all to hear. "Hiding your new bride from us all night. Come on, Caleb, let us announce this thing properly. Show everyone what this partnership is all about." Caleb's face became a perfect, unreadable mask. "Hold on now, sir, maybe we ought to—" Victor just laughed, and the sound of it boomed across the whole room. "We've been waiting all blessed night. My little girl deserves her moment." He tugged Margaret right up front, then snatched Caleb's hand and laid it square on top of Margaret's. "There now, a promise made in front of everybody. Hartwell land and Fairfax connections, finally tied together." A few folks started clapping, but it was thin and unsure. Margaret's smile looked like it was painted on. And Caleb, well, Caleb looked like a coyote with his foot in a trap. Senator Morrison shuffled forward, lifting his champagne flute. "To the fine young couple, may your union bring prosperity to—" He never got to finish. That's when some drunk fella, one of Morrison's business pals Elena didn't know, grabbed her by the arm. He hauled her clean out of the shadows and into the middle of the ballroom. "Well, looky here," he slurred, his grip tight enough to leave a mark. "The little seamstress. Been keeping my eye on you, darling. Thought you could hide from me, but I found you." Every single head in that room swiveled to stare. Elena tried to wrench her arm free, but he held on tight, his other hand groping for her waist. Now come on, don't be bashful. Pretty little things like you are here for our entertainment, ain't that right? A hot wave of shame washed over her. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting up, folks deciding right then and there what kind of woman she was. "Let go of me," she said, her voice shaking less than she felt. "Not just yet," he grinned. "Ain't had my dance." "I do believe the lady told you to let her go." The voice sliced through the party chatter like a sharp knife, cold and firm, and not about to take no for an answer. Caleb Hartwell stood not 10 feet away, his face looking like it was carved from granite. But his eyes were burning with something fierce. The drunk fella gave a shaky laugh. "Now hold on, Caleb. No need to get all high and mighty. We're just having a little fun is all." "Let her go." The whole room went dead quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. The musicians even stopped their playing. The man let go of Elena's arm and took a clumsy step back. "No harm done, see? Just a little misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding." Caleb said it soft-like. But he was moving forward with the smooth, dangerous walk of a panther. "You put your hands on a lady without her say-so, shamed her in front of 100 people, and now you want to call it a misunderstanding." "Caleb," Senator Morrison cut in, his voice all tight and nervous. "I'm sure Edwards here didn't mean any harm. Maybe we should all just—" "No." Caleb stopped about 3 feet from Elena. He gave her one quick look, up and down, like he was checking for damage. Then his eyes locked back on Edwards. "You will tell the lady you're sorry, and then you will get out of my house." "Lady?" Edwards sneered, getting bold again from the whiskey. "Oh, come on, Caleb, we all know what she is." "A seamstress?" he snorted. "Is that the new word for it?" The insult just hung there in the air, thick and ugly. Caleb's hands balled up into tight fists. For a second, Eleanor thought he was going to lay the man out flat. But he did something that surprised everyone even more. He turned to her, and his dark eyes met hers with a look so strong it nearly took her breath away. And then he smiled. It was just a small, slow curve of his lips that didn't touch his eyes. But it changed the whole room. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low, still looking right at Elena, "allow me to clear up any confusion." He reached out for her hand, and Elena, too shocked to do anything else, let him take it. His palm was warm and rough from work, and steady. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss right on her knuckles. It was such a personal, deliberate move that you could hear folks gasp all across the room. Then Caleb Hartwell turned to face all those staring eyes still holding Elena's hand, and said 5 words that would turn both their lives upside down. "Y'all, I'd like you to meet my wife." The silence that came after was so complete it was deafening. Elena felt like all the air had been punched out of her. She couldn't think, couldn't figure out what was happening. Margaret Fairfax let out a noise like a hurt animal. Her father, Victor, turned a shade of purple you don't see too often. Senator Morrison's champagne glass just dropped from his hand and shattered all over the floor. And Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, standing over by the doorway, put a hand to her mouth to cover what looked an awful lot like a smile. Caleb's hand tightened on Elena's, not enough to hurt, but just enough to ground her in the hurricane he'd just started. "What?" Victor Fairfax finally managed to choke out. "What in the devil are you talking about? You're supposed to marry my daughter." "That was a mistake," Caleb said, calm as you please. "One I'm fixing right now." He glanced over at Margaret, and for the first time all night his face softened with real regret. "Miss Fairfax, I am truly sorry. This was the wrong way to go about things, all of it. But I can't marry you when I'm already married to another." "When?" Morrison demanded. "This is plumb crazy. When did this supposed marriage happen?" 3 months back, Caleb said, not missing a beat. "A private ceremony in Denver." He looked down at Elena then, and she saw a silent question in his eyes. "Just play along. Please, just for a little while." And Elena, who had nothing left to lose and a whole world to gain, who knew all about being desperate, made her choice. She squeezed his hand right back. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, looking out at the stunned crowd but talking right to him. "We never meant to fool anyone. We were just waiting for the right time to tell his family properly, but—" She let her voice fade, letting them imagine the rest. "This is a lie," Victor Fairfax roared. "A pathetic, see-through lie to wiggle out of his commitment." "Then prove it," Caleb shot back. "Go on, right to the courthouse in Denver. Check their books. You'll find the record." It was a bluff. It had to be. But he said it with so much certainty that you could see the doubt start to creep into Victor's face. Margaret Fairfax had gone white as a sheet. "Caleb," she whispered, "please, don't do this." For just a heartbeat, Elena saw something like pity on Caleb's face. Then it hardened back into steel. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said softly. "You deserve the truth. And the truth is, I could never have been the husband you deserve. It's better you find out tonight than 10 years down the road." He turned, still holding onto Elena's hand, and looked at his mother. "I apologize for the scene this caused. This should have been handled in private." Mrs. Hartwell looked from her son to Elena, and you couldn't tell what she was thinking. Then she gave a slow nod. "I reckon," she said with a surprising amount of calm, "that it's time for our guest to head on home. The party is surely over." The room just exploded. Morrison and Victor were both trying to shout over each other, yelling for proof, threatening lawsuits, saying it was all a sham. But Caleb paid them no mind. He just started walking toward the door, pulling Elena gently alongside him, leaving all that noise and anger behind them. They walked up the grand staircase without saying a word, the shouting finally fading away below them. When they reached the second-floor landing, Caleb finally stopped and let go of her hand. "I am sorry," he said, his voice sounding tired and rough. "I had no business dragging you into that mess." Elena's legs felt like they might give out. Her hand was still warm from his. "You saved me from that man, from what he thought I was. And I just made a different kind of assumption about you," Caleb said. "Different maybe, but just as wrong." He ran a hand through his perfectly combed hair, messing it all up. "The truth is, I panicked. I saw a way out of that engagement, a way to get out from under Morrison's thumb. And I took it. I didn't stop to think what it might cost you." "What will it cost me?" He really looked at her then, seeing past the simple dress and worn-out coat, and looked right at her. "Everything, or maybe nothing. All depends on what we do next." "And what do we do next?" Caleb leaned back against the banister, the weight of the night finally settling on his shoulders. "Tomorrow, Morrison and Fairfax will start digging. They'll check the records in Denver. They'll ask questions. When they don't find proof of any marriage, they'll be back here breathing fire. This house is going to become a war zone," he said, meeting her gaze. "Unless we make the lie real." Elena's heart just stopped cold. "Real?" "Not a true marriage," he said quickly. "A business arrangement, paperwork, documents, enough proof to make the story hold up." He stood up straight, all business now, like a rancher cutting a deal. "I can pay you. I'll clear any debts you have and set you up with your own dress shop somewhere far away from all this. Once it's all over, all you have to do is pretend to be my wife for 6 months, maybe a year, just long enough for the whole scandal to settle down and for me to get untangled from Morrison's political ambitions." "Pretend to be your wife," Elena repeated, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "In public, that's all. You would have your own room, live your own life. We would just need to look like a couple when people are watching." His face turned serious. "I know it's a hell of a thing to ask, but I'm asking anyway. I'm desperate, and well, you look like a woman who knows what desperate feels like." He was right about that. She did. Elena thought about her sister back in Denver, all alone in that drafty little cottage, waiting for money that might never arrive. She thought about the notices from the bank, the final warning, the due date coming at them like a runaway train. She thought about all the years ahead of her, just scraping by, just surviving. "How much?" she asked, her voice low. Caleb named a number that made her feel dizzy. It was enough to save the cottage, enough to open her own shop. It was enough to change her entire life. "And you're certain this will work?" "No," he said honestly. "But it's the only card I've got left to play." Elena looked at this man, this stranger who had called her his wife to save them both. She saw the bone-deep weariness in his eyes, the tightness in his shoulders, and the sliver of hope he was trying so hard to hide. He was betting everything on her, trusting her with his ranch, his good name, his future. She remembered what Mary had said in the kitchen. "We don't get to choose. We do what we have to do to get by." "1 year," Elena said, "and you pay off all my family's debts, not just mine. And the shop will be in Denver, close to my sister." A look of pure relief washed over Caleb's face. "Done. And one more thing." Elena stepped a little closer, tilting her chin up to look him right in the eye. "When this is all done, when we go our separate ways, you do not get to have an opinion on how I live my life after. You do not get to check up on me or judge my choices. We walk away with no ties, no strings, and no guilt." "Agreed." He held out his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Elena looked at his offered hand, calloused and strong. A hand that was offering her a way out that was wrapped up in a lie. She thought about all the things that could go wrong, about the scandal and the shame, and the chance that this deception might ruin them both. Then she thought about her sister's face when Elena could tell her their little cottage was safe for good, about a shop with her very own name on the window, about a future that was more than just getting by. She took his hand. "We have a deal." His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and solid, sealing their pact. For better or for worse, Elena Cross had just become Elena Hartwell, at least on paper, at least for a little while. As they stood there in the hallway, their hands clasped in a bargain that felt like both a blessing and a curse, neither of them saw Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell watching from the shadows of the staircase, a thoughtful look on her face. "Well now," she murmured to herself, "this is either going to be a complete disaster or the best thing that ever happened to that stubborn boy of mine." Only time would tell which one it would be, but downstairs the party was finally over. The guests were heading home, taking with them enough scandalous gossip to keep the entire territory talking for years. And somewhere in all that chaos, a lie was starting to grow, a lie that would turn into something neither Caleb nor Elena could have ever imagined. The deal was made. Now came the hard part, living with it. The morning sun had not even begun to climb over the mountains, when Elena woke up and found a cream-colored envelope that had been slipped under her door. Inside, written in a man's neat handwriting, was just one sentence. "My study, 7 o'clock in the morning. We need to make this thing official." She got dressed with care in her better dress, the blue cotton one that had gotten her through job interviews and Sunday services, and she found her way downstairs. The house was so quiet after all the noise from last night. The grand room was stripped of its party decorations, showing off the elegant house underneath. Her footsteps made echoes on the shiny wood floors. Caleb's study was in the back part of the house, looking out at the eastern hills. She knocked twice before she heard his voice call out, "Come on in." He was standing behind a huge oak desk that was covered in papers. He was dressed in work clothes now, just dark trousers and a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. You could see the strong muscles in his forearms. His hair was a little damp, like he had just washed up, and he had dark circles under his eyes that made it seem like he had slept just as poorly as she had. "Coffee?" He pointed to a pot on a side table. "Please." Elena poured a cup for herself with hands that felt like they wanted to shake, but she forced them to be steady. The coffee was strong and bitter, and it helped pull her back to this unbelievable situation. Caleb stayed standing, looking over the papers in front of him like a general who was planning an attack. "I have been working since 4, he said, without any small talk, trying to figure out every trick Morrison and Fairfax will use to prove our marriage is not real." He looked up then, and his dark eyes met hers with a directness that was uncomfortable. "They will look into everything. Your past, your family, where you have been these last few months. They will look for inconsistencies." "Then we'd better get our story straight," Elena said, her own voice surprisingly steady. A flicker of what might have been approval crossed his face. "Exactly." He pointed to a chair across from his desk. "Have a seat. This is going to take a while." For the next 2 hours, they built their story, one careful piece at a time. They had met in Denver 4 months back, Caleb decided, when he was in the city for business. Elena had been working in a dress shop, which was true enough she could offer details if someone pushed her. They had found themselves drawn together, even though they came from different worlds. He had courted her quietly, not wanting his mother to get involved or for Morrison to use the connection for politics. "We got married in a small ceremony," Caleb said, scribbling notes. "Just us and 2 witnesses we paid to keep quiet. No family, no big announcement. We were planning on telling everyone after the busy season was over, but then Morrison pushed that engagement to Margaret and I panicked. I made the wrong call, agreed to something I had no business agreeing to." "Why didn't you just tell him about me then?" Elena asked, trying to follow the path of the tale they were spinning. "Fear," Caleb said, plain and simple. "Fear that he would find a way to use you against me. And that part is actually true. Morrison would do that in a heartbeat." His jaw went tight. "He has been trying to get his hands on this ranch for years. My father told him no, and I have told him no. A partnership with the Fairfax family would have given him the political pull to force my hand. And now, well, now I've burned that bridge completely." He stared out the window at the land stretching out to the horizon. "Now Morrison is my enemy, not just my problem. But at least this is honest." Elena took a sip of her coffee, watching him. In the light of day, without all the noise of the party, she could see him better. She saw the worry lines etched deep around his eyes, the way his shoulders were set, telling of burdens he had carried alone for far too long. He was younger than she had first guessed, maybe 32 or 33, but he held himself like a man much older than his years. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. "Last night you said something to your mother about not wanting to do this to another woman." A wall slammed down behind his eyes in an instant. "That is not part of our deal. If we are going to sell this story, I need to know what broke you," Elena pushed on. "People will see it. They will wonder why a man like you would secretly marry a woman like me. The story needs a real heart, even if the facts are all made up." Caleb's hands balled into fists on the desk. For a long moment, she was sure he was going to say no. Then slowly he sat back down, the movement weighed down with a sense of defeat. "Her name was Catherine," he said, his voice held carefully level. "We were engaged 6 years ago. She was beautiful, smart, came from a good family. I thought—" He stopped and had to swallow hard. "I thought she loved me. That she loved this life, this land. We had it all planned out. The wedding, our future, the children we would raise right here." His laugh had no humor in it. "3 weeks before the wedding, I found her in the barn with my father's business partner. She told me she could never love a man as stiff and cold as me, that she only said yes for my money and my name. She had been seeing him for months." A wave of sympathy tightened in Elena's chest. "I am sorry." "Do not be. She was right." Caleb finally met her gaze, and the emptiness in his eyes was a whole lot worse than anger would have been. "I am stiff. I am cold. I have spent 6 years proving her right, building my walls so high that nothing can get over them. When my mother and Morrison started pushing for the engagement to Margaret, I agreed because it just did not matter. Margaret did not love me. I did not love her. It was a clean, simple deal. It was exactly what I deserved. That is not true, Elena said before she could catch the words. You do not know me. No, she agreed. But I know what it feels like to believe you do not deserve to be happy because somebody told you so. My father told me I was worthless every single day he was alive. He said I would never be anything, that I was a burden, and that the world would be a better place without me in it. She put her coffee cup down on the desk with a careful, deliberate motion. He was wrong, and so was Catherine. Caleb just stared at her, something shifting deep behind his eyes that she could not quite read. Then he looked away, back at the papers on his desk, and his voice came out all gravel when he spoke. We should get back to it. Morrison will be here by noon, and we need to be ready. They spent another hour going over their story, memorizing every little detail. The name of the Denver courthouse where they supposedly filed the paperwork, the date of their pretend ceremony, the hotel where they spent their wedding night. Caleb had already sent his ranch foreman to Denver with orders to create a paper trail, even if it meant bribing some clerks to backdate the papers. It was a big risk, probably illegal, but Caleb faced it with that same grim resolve he likely brought to every hard task in his life. There is one last thing, he said at last, sliding a stack of papers across the desk. Our actual contract, the real agreement between us, the one nobody else will ever lay eyes on. Elena read it over carefully. The terms he was offering were generous, more than generous. $5,000 as soon as she signed, paid straight out to clear her family's debts. Another $5,000 at the end of 12 months. The deed to a shop in Denver put in her name, whether she finished the full year or not. A place to live and food on the table at the ranch for the whole time, and a clothing allowance so she could look the part of a rancher's wife. And if I break the contract, she asked, you keep everything I have already given you. I am not a monster, Miss Cross. I will not punish you for changing your mind. Elena, she corrected him. If we are supposed to be married, you probably ought to use my first name. Elena, he said again. And there was something in the way he said it so careful, like he was testing the feel of it on his tongue that made her heart beat a little faster. There is one more part, the most important one. He leaned forward, his face deadly serious. No romantic feelings, no expectations of anything more than what we have agreed on. This is a business deal. When it is over, we walk away like strangers who did each other a favor. Nothing more. Elena looked at the words written there in that same neat handwriting. It seemed like such a simple rule. So easy to agree to when you were just sitting across a desk from a man you hardly knew, building lies to fool the whole world. Why? She asked. Why what? Why is that rule so important to you? Caleb's expression did not change, but his knuckles went white where he gripped the edge of the desk. Because feelings make things messy. Because people get hurt when what they expect does not match up with what is real. And because I will not survive having someone else look at me the way Catherine did. Like I was some kind of burden they had to put up with. And you think I would do that? I reckon anyone would, he said, his voice low. If you give it enough time and stay close enough. So we are not going to give it time. We will keep our distance, keep this professional, make it through the year, and if we are lucky, we can walk away as friends. Elena reached for the pen he had placed next to the contract. Friends. That was more than she had known in months, and a whole lot less than the complicated feeling growing in her chest as she looked at this broken man trying so hard to shield himself. 1 year, she said, no feelings, just business. Just business, he echoed. She wrote her name on the bottom line of the contract, Elena Cross, who would soon be Elena Hartwell, and pushed it back across the desk. Caleb added his signature below hers, then took a small box from his desk drawer. "You are going to need this," he said, opening it to show a simple gold band. "It belonged to my grandmother. Mother insisted you should have something real to wear." Elena felt a lump form in her throat as he lifted the ring from its velvet cushion. It was beautiful because it was so simple, just a thin band of gold with tiny flowers etched into it, worn smooth after all these years. A ring that once meant something real, that held the weight of true vows and true love. "I cannot," she whispered. "This is too much." "It is just a prop," Caleb said, but his voice was softer now. "Just like everything else about this deal. May I?" She held out her left hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it was made for her, settling onto her skin as if it had always been there. His fingers, warm and calloused and gentle, stayed for just a second before he pulled back. "There," he said, all business once more. "Now you look like a wife." A knock on the door cut them off. Mrs. Hartwell walked in without even waiting for an answer. Her face showed a mix of worry and something that looked a little like amusement. "I figured you would want to know," she said. "Morrison's carriage just pulled up the drive. He brought a lawyer with him." Her eyes darted between them, taking in the ring on Elena's finger and the signed papers on the desk. "Are you two ready for this?" "No," Caleb said plainly, "but we will handle it." Mrs. Hartwell came over to Elena and took her hand gently to look at the ring. "I have not seen this in 20 years, she said softly. "My mother-in-law wore it every single day of her marriage, 53 years, right up to the day she passed." She looked up and met Elena's gaze. "I do not know what kind of game you two are playing, or why, but that ring has only ever been on the hands of women who loved the men they married. You remember that." Before Elena could say a word, Mrs. Hartwell swept out of the room, leaving a heavy silence behind her. "She does not know about the contract," Caleb said. "Nobody does but us. To the rest of the world, and that includes my family, we are really married." "Then we had better put on a good show for them," Elena said, standing up and smoothing down her skirt. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were perfectly still. "Where do you want me to be when Morrison gets here?" Caleb stood up too, walking around the desk. For the very first time since she had met him, something that looked like a real smile touched his lips, a little grim, but honest. "Right by my side," he said, "where a wife belongs." They met Morrison in the formal parlor, a room that smelled like beeswax and old money. The senator had his lawyer with him, a man with sharp eyes named Blackwood, who was carrying a leather case, filled with papers. Victor Fairfax was nowhere to be seen, which meant he was either too mad to show up or was already scheming up something worse. Morrison did not even bother to sit down. He paced the room like a trapped animal, his face flushed with a rage he was barely holding back. "This is a joke," he said without any pleasantries. "A desperate lie coming from a desperate man. Did you honestly think we would not look into this?" "Investigate all you want," Caleb said, his voice even. He stood with one hand resting lightly on the small of Elena's back, a possessive gesture that looked completely natural but felt like a bolt of lightning on her skin. "You will find marriage papers filed in Denver on July 23rd. You will find the clerk who handled them. You will find the witnesses who put their names on them." "Forged," Morrison spat. "Every last bit of it is forged. Prove it." Blackwood placed his case on a small table and pulled out a stack of papers with careful precision. "We will prove it, Mr. Hartwell. We are going to talk to every single clerk in the Denver courthouse. We will find those witnesses and question them under oath. We will track Miss Cross's every move for the past 6 months. And when we find the holes in your story, and believe me, we will find them, we will have what we need for fraud charges." "Her name is Mrs. Hartwell," Caleb corrected him softly. "And you are welcome to try." Elena could feel the tension in him through that light touch on her back, could feel how much effort it was taking for him to keep up this calm appearance. She took a small step forward, making herself the center of attention. "Senator Morrison," she said, keeping her voice steady, I understand why you are angry. This news was a surprise, and the timing is not great. But I can assure you our marriage is real. The lie felt sour in her mouth, but she said it with the same certainty she used to use when convincing landlords she could pay the rent she did not have. Caleb and I wanted to wait to announce it the right way, to give his family some time to get used to the idea. We never wanted to hurt anyone. Morrison's eyes scanned over her with disdain. You want me to believe that Caleb Hartwell, one of the richest ranchers in all of Wyoming, secretly married a seamstress with nothing to her name? What did he promise you? What did you ask for as payment for this little show? The insult hit her like a slap, but Elena did not even flinch. She had been through worse. He did not promise me anything but himself, she said, which is a whole lot more than some people get in a lifetime of proper marriages. Something in the room changed, a small shift in the air, in the look on Morrison's face. He looked at Elena again with a new kind of assessment, maybe realizing she was not the easy pushover he thought she was. We will see, he said at last. Blackwood filed the investigation request with the territorial court. I want every document, every witness, every moment of Miss Cross's life looked into. He turned to Caleb. And you, Caleb? You just made a mistake that is going to cost you dearly. Victor Fairfax is already talking to other ranchers, getting them together to challenge your water rights. Without the Fairfax alliance, you are exposed. I give you 6 months before you come crawling back, begging for our help. Then you will be waiting a long, long time, Caleb said. Morrison stormed out with Blackwood right behind him, carrying his papers and his threats. The second the door shut, Caleb's hand fell from Elena's back, and he walked over to the window, putting a bit of room between them. That sure went off without a hitch, he said, his voice laced with bitter humor. Elena felt like her knees might just give out. The rush that had seen her through that whole confrontation was fading fast. He's going to dig into everything. Yes, and he is going to find every last thing we set out for him to find. Caleb turned, and his face was set like stone. But he is right about the politics of it all. Without the Fairfax name backing me, I have lost some powerful friends. The other ranchers will smell blood in the water. They will see this as a moment of weakness, like I have lost my sense. They will start pushing, trying to see what they can take. He raked a hand through his hair, a frustrated gesture that made him look 10 years younger. I knew this was going to be hard. I just did not figure on it getting worse this quick. Mrs. Hartwell came in just then, holding a tea tray like a woman who believed a good cup of tea could fix just about anything. Well, she said, her voice crisp, that was quite the show, Elena. Here, you handled that Morrison fella perfectly. I nearly believed you myself. Elena took the teacup with a grateful nod, letting it warm her chilled hands. I've had my share of practice lying to folks who thought they were better than me, I can only imagine. Mrs. Hartwell sat, smoothing her skirts with a well-practiced grace. Now, we have practical things to talk about. Caleb, you cannot just hide Elena away like some dirty little secret. People need to see you two together. See that this marriage is the real deal. The church social is this Sunday. You will both be there. Mother, do not start mothering me, she said, cutting him off. You made this bed. Now you have to lie in it, and lie in it right, or Morrison will find every single crack in your story. Elena needs decent clothes, a proper introduction to our neighbors, and some lessons in how to be the wife of a man who runs one of the biggest ranches around. And you, she aimed a finger right at Caleb, you need to stop looking at her like she is a line item on a ledger and start looking at her like a man who is supposed to be head over heels in love. Caleb's jaw went tight. I am not an actor. Then you had best learn, Mrs. Hartwell replied with no sympathy at all. Because if you cannot make folks believe this marriage is real, you are going to lose it all. The ranch, your good name, and any chance of getting out from under Morrison's thumb. Is your pride worth all that? The quiet that fell over the room was thick with everything they were not saying. At last, Caleb looked over at Elena, and she saw the question plain as day in his eyes. Can you pull this off? Can you be the woman I need you to be right now? She thought about the contract sitting upstairs, the heavy ring on her finger, and the $5,000 that was already on its way to settle the debts that had been a shadow over her family for years. She pictured her sister's face when she got the telegram Elena sent that morning. Everything is going to be okay now. I can do it, she said, her voice steady and low. Whatever it takes. A wave of something that looked like relief washed over Caleb's face. Then we get started today. Mother is right. We need to be seen around, so it all looks natural when folks talk. He put his teacup down with a sense of finality. Come with me. I will show you the ranch, introduce you to the foreman and the key men. We will ride the property line. Have lunch out in the south pasture where folks can see us. Start making this story look real. I do not ride, Elena confessed. Then you will ride with me. It will look romantic. The way he said it suggested it would be anything but. Just another scene played out for an audience they could not see. They spent that afternoon acting out the parts they had written for themselves. Caleb showed her the whole cattle operation, the breeding program his daddy had started, and he had built up the irrigation system that made this land turn a profit. He introduced her to men who tipped their hats and gave her curious looks, to ranch hands who knew their boss well enough to see the tension in his shoulders but were too decent to say a word. And they rode. Elena sat in front of Caleb on his big black gelding, his arms around her as he held the reins, his body a warm, solid presence at her back. It should have felt strange, maybe even wrong. Instead, it was the safest Elena had felt in a long, long time. You are very good at this, she said as they reached the crest of a hill that overlooked miles of grazing land. At riding? At running a ranch? At looking after all the people who count on you? She looked over her shoulder at him. Why did you ever think you were a cold man? His arms tightened just a little around her. Because I do not feel things the way other people do. I do not connect with them easy. Catherine was right about that. I am better with cattle and land than I am with people. I think you connect just fine, Elena said. You just do not trust it anymore. He did not answer, but she felt the change in his breathing. She felt the exact moment he pulled back inside himself, even though he could not move an inch away without her falling right off the horse. They got back just as the sun was going down, painting the whole ranch in shades of gold and orange. Mrs. Hartwell had already seen to it that Elena's things were moved into a bedroom in the family wing. Not Caleb's room, thank goodness, but right next door to keep up appearances. There is a connecting door, Mrs. Hartwell explained when she showed Elena the room. It locks from both sides, so you will have your privacy. But the staff will just assume you are sharing a bed like any married couple. She stopped in the doorway, giving Elena a long, shrewd look. My son is a complicated man. He is wounded, stubborn, and too honorable for his own good. Whatever deal you two have struck, I hope you will be kind to him. I will try, Elena promised, and she meant it. And Elena, I hope he will be kind to you too. That night, Elena lay in a bed that felt softer than a cloud, wearing a borrowed nightgown that likely cost more than all the clothes she had ever owned put together, and she tried to make sense of what she had walked into. Through the wall, she could hear Caleb moving about in his room, the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floors, a drawer opening, the clink of a glass as he poured water. They were husband and wife, but not really. Living under the same roof but in separate worlds, pretending at closeness while keeping a careful distance. It was supposed to be simple. Just a business deal, a way to survive, just 1 year to get through. But as Elena touched the ring on her finger, feeling its warmth against her skin, she wondered if anything that involved the human heart could ever be simple, even when you did your level best to leave the heart out of it. Sunday came up way too fast. The church social was held on the lawn behind the little white chapel that served the whole scattered ranching community. And it looked like every family from within 50 miles had turned out to get a look at Caleb Hartwell's mysterious new wife. Elena wore a brand new dress of pale green cotton that Mrs. Hartwell had somehow managed to have made in 3 days, and it fit her like a glove. Her hair was swept up in a style much fancier than anything she could do herself, twisted and pinned by Mrs. Hartwell's own lady's maid with pearl combs that sparkled in the sun. You look beautiful, Caleb said when she came. The main house. His voice was steady, but there was a genuine warmth in his eyes. Maybe it was gratitude, or maybe just relief that she looked the part he needed her to play. "You're looking mighty sharp yourself," she said back, admiring his dark suit and crisp white shirt. He had even managed to comb that wild hair of his. He held out his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him under the fabric. "Now remember," he said softly as they headed for the carriage, "we're head over heels. Can't get enough of each other. Every touch, every look has to sell this story." "Just a business deal," Elena whispered to herself. But her heart was hammering way too fast for it to be just anything. The church picnic was in full swing, with families spread out on quilts and children tearing between the trees. Long tables were just about breaking under the weight of all the potluck dishes. Talk died down and heads started to turn when Caleb helped Elena from the carriage, his hand staying on her waist a second too long. "Smile," he whispered, "like you're happy to be here." And she did. He led her into the crowd, his hand resting on the small of her back. It was a possessive gesture that was starting to feel dangerously natural. Folks parted for them like the Red Sea, staring and whispering behind their hands. "Caleb!" An older woman wearing a hat big enough to shade a small horse came toward them like an act of God. "Is this your mystery bride? You better introduce us right now." "Mrs. Patterson," Caleb said, his voice full of real affection. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Elena." He turned to Elena. "Mrs. Patterson runs the biggest cattle operation in the Northern Territory and has forgotten more about ranching than I'll ever know." Mrs. Patterson's sharp gaze sized Elena up with the same keen eye she probably used on her prize-winning cattle. "Heard y'all got hitched in secret. How romantic." The word was practically dripping with doubt. "Tell me, honey, how in the world did you meet my Caleb?" That was the start of it, a polite but steady stream of questions from one woman after another. Elena chose her words with care, sticking to the story she and Caleb had put together, adding little details here and there to make the whole lie feel a bit more real. Yes, they had met in Denver. Yes, it was all very sudden. And yes, they were just so happy. The whole time, Caleb played his role perfectly. He would touch her elbow, put a hand on her shoulder, or take her hand in his, building this picture of a loving couple through constant, gentle contact. He brought her a glass of lemonade, fixed her a plate of food, and stood so close she could feel the heat coming off him and smell the clean scent of his morning soap. "You're a natural at this," she murmured when they had a quiet moment to themselves. "I told you, I'm not a cold man. I'm just a careful one." His eyes kept scanning the crowd, always on the lookout. "And right now, being careful means making sure every soul here believes I'm a man so smitten with his new wife that he can't stand to be more than arm's length away." "You think it's working?" "Just look around," he said in a low voice. Elena did. She saw how folks were watching them, how the suspicion in their eyes was slowly turning into a grudging kind of belief. She saw younger women looking at them with a touch of envy. She saw older couples smiling, satisfied to see young love in bloom. The lie was taking hold. They were pulling it off. "Caleb Hartwell." A chilly voice sliced through the warm afternoon air. "I sure didn't figure on seeing you here." A tall, silver-haired man approached them. He was dressed in expensive clothes and wore a look of pure contempt. Elena didn't need to be told this was Victor Fairfax. "Victor," Caleb said, his voice level, "how's Margaret doing?" "She's heartbroken, as you might guess, though she's handling the shame of being left at the altar better than most women would." Fairfax's gaze flicked over to Elena, dismissing her completely. "I'm sure she'll find herself a suitable husband soon, one who cares more about honor than some passing whim." "I'm sure she will," Caleb replied. "She deserves a man who can truly love her." "And you reckon you're the man for that?" Fairfax sneered, waving a hand toward Elena. "With her? A woman you supposedly married in secret instead of giving her a decent wedding? A woman whose own family ain't even here to see it?" Elena felt Caleb go rigid beside her, a wave of anger coming off him. Before he could say something that would blow their whole act apart, she stepped forward. "Mr. Fairfax," she said quietly, "I am truly sorry for any hurt this has caused your daughter. But I will not apologize for marrying the man I love, even if things didn't happen the way everyone expected." She reached out and took Caleb's hand, twining her fingers with his. "And my family isn't here because they're back in Denver, handling problems I couldn't face on my own. My husband paid off those debts for me. That's the kind of man he is. He protects the people he cares for, no matter the cost to himself." It was the gospel truth twisted around a lie, and it hit its mark perfectly. Fairfax's expression changed. First surprise, then a flicker of calculation, and finally a grudging respect. "Well," he said at last, "I suppose time will tell what kind of bargain you two have really made." He started to walk away, then stopped. "But Elena, when this all goes south, and Morrison is making damn sure it will, don't you come looking for sympathy from folks who knew better all along." He turned and left, leaving the air crackling with tension behind him. Elena's hand was still in Caleb's, his grip now so tight it almost hurt. When she glanced up at him, his face was a careful blank mask. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For making things worse. I shouldn't have said anything." "You were perfect," he said, his voice rough. He pulled her a little closer, resting his forehead on hers. It looked like a tender moment, but it felt more like they were holding on for dear life. "Thank you." They stayed like that for a single heartbeat. Two people playing at love while their hearts pounded with fear and adrenaline, and something else neither of them dared to name. Then Caleb pulled back, his face becoming neutral again. "We ought to head out," he said. "We've showed our faces." On the ride back to the ranch, Elena watched the landscape roll by. She tried to ignore the warmth where his hand had held hers, the memory of his forehead against her own, and the way her body reacted to him being so near, as if it couldn't tell the difference between a performance and the real thing. No feelings, the contract had stated. Just business. But as the silent miles passed, Elena had to wonder how long they could keep that promise when every touch, every glance, and every fake moment of closeness was teaching their bodies to believe the story they were telling the world. And up in the driver's seat, handling the horses with an easy skill, Caleb wondered the exact same thing and was scared of the answer. The next few weeks fell into a routine that started to feel almost natural, which should have been Elena's first clue something was wrong. She and Caleb went about their days like two partners in a well-rehearsed play. They had breakfast together in the morning room where the staff could see them, then went their separate ways for the day. Dinners were spent with Mrs. Hartwell, where they kept up the act of being happy newlyweds. Their evenings were spent in the same rooms, always close, but never really crossing that line into true intimacy. They were getting good at all the little things, the easy affection that married couples show without a second thought. Caleb's hand would find the small of her back as they passed through a door. Elena learned to straighten his collar when it was out of place, letting her fingers rest there just long enough to look familiar. They even came up with their own inside jokes and shared looks, the kind of shorthand people develop after knowing each other for years, not just a few crazy weeks. It was all an act. It had to be. But Elena was starting to forget where the pretend part ended. And then something even more risky began to happen. She started to notice little things about him, the way he drank his coffee, black and strong enough to float a horseshoe. How he'd rub the back of his neck when the ranch paperwork was frustrating him. The little hint of a smile he'd get when a ranch hand told a truly awful joke. The careful way he handled everything, as if life had taught him early on that being reckless only led to ruin. She also noticed the way he would look at her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't watching. It was a look of pure confusion, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had no right answer, before he'd lock it all down again behind a blank stare. "You're staring," he said one night as they sat in the library, each pretending to be interested in a book while really just sitting in the same room. "I was just thinking," Elena replied, not trying to deny it, "about how peculiar this all is. How we know all these little facts about each other now. You know I hate mornings, and I know how you take your coffee and how you keep your desk. But we don't truly know each other one bit. Caleb put his book down and gave her his complete attention. What is it you want to know? What makes you happy? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for a good long while, the firelight dancing on his face. I don't rightly know anymore, he finally confessed. I used to think it was the ranch, this land, seeing things grow and do well because of my work. He trailed off and shook his head. But lately I wonder if I'm just walking through my own life, getting by instead of really living. He looked straight at her, and the raw honesty in his eyes made her chest feel tight. What about you? What makes Elena Cross happy? Hartwell, she corrected him gently. On paper, at least. Hartwell, he repeated. The way he said her new name sent a surprising warmth spreading through her. Elena gave his question some real thought. Making something beautiful with my own two hands. Making a piece of clothing fit just right. Seeing a woman put on a dress I made and feel strong, confident, like somebody finally sees her. She gave a small smile. Little things, I guess, not some big grand plan. There ain't nothing small about making beauty, Caleb said, or about making folks feel like they matter. Their eyes met across the space separating their chairs, and something real passed between them. Maybe it was recognition or understanding, a silent agreement that they were both just people who had learned how to found their comfort in quiet work and gentle gestures, since life had kept bigger happinesses out of their reach. Just then, Mrs. Hartwell came in, shattering the peace like a rock hitting a window pane. Ah, good. Y'all are both here, she announced without preamble. I received a letter from the Hendersons. They are throwing a harvest dance come Saturday, and have specifically asked that you both attend. I am afraid it is required. It seems like half the territory will be there. Caleb's face went hard as granite in an instant. We will go for a little while. You will do more than just show your faces, his mother stated flatly. You will dance with your wife. You will visit with folks. You are going to prove to everyone that this marriage of yours is rock solid, no matter what gossip and rumors Morrison is spreading. She turned her gaze on Elena. Can you dance, dear? Not very well, Elena confessed. I never really had the chance to learn the right way. Then Caleb can teach you. Caleb, you have 1 week. Mrs. Hartwell swept out of the room just as forcefully as she had come in, leaving them with another challenge to sort out. Caleb got to his feet and walked to the middle of the room where the furniture was pushed aside to make a clear space. Well now, he offered, holding out his hand. Shall we dance? Elena got up, her legs feeling like they might give out. Now. There is no better time than the present. And we are going to need the practice if we want to fool anybody into thinking we have done this before. She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her in closer than she had ever been to him. One of his hands rested on her waist, while the other held her fingers, with almost no room left between their bodies. Up this close, she could make out the little gold specks in his dark eyes. She could smell the faint scent of cedar and worn leather that always seemed to be part of him. She could feel the steady heat coming from his body. Just relax, he whispered. Relax. I am not going to let you fall. That is not what I am afraid of, she thought before the words could escape her lips. His gaze searched hers, full of questions, but he let it go. Instead, he started to hum the tune of a waltz, leading her through the movements with a grace that surprised her. She was clumsy at first, tripping on his boots and whispering apologies, but he had the patience of a saint, changing his own steps to help her and holding her tight whenever she wobbled. You are thinking on it too much, he told her, after she nearly fell over her own feet for the 3rd time. Stop trying to count. Just follow me. Trust that I will lead you right. Trust. It was such a small word for such a huge idea, but Elena just shut her eyes and let herself feel the rhythm of his low humming, the sure guidance of his hands, and his solid presence beside her. And then, slowly, almost like a miracle, they started to dance as one. It was not perfect, but it was together. Her feet finally understood the steps. Her body began to know his next move before he made it, and when she finally opened her eyes, they were truly dancing. "There now," Caleb said in a low voice, and there was a new roughness and warmth in his tone. "See, you have got it." They practiced like that every single evening afterward. Sometimes his mother would play a real song for them on the piano, but other times it was just the two of them in the library, with Caleb's humming as their only music. Each time they practiced, the distance between them seemed to get a little smaller. Elena's hand might wander from his shoulder to the nape of his neck. His hand would flatten on her waist, bringing her just a tiny bit closer. They quit talking when they danced, letting the motion say everything for them, and Elena started to live for those brief times when she had to touch him, when being near him was part of the deal, when she could fool herself into thinking the fast pounding in her chest was just from the dancing. The evening before the Hendersons' party, they stayed up practicing later than they usually did. Mrs. Hartwell had gone to bed early, saying she had a headache, which left them by themselves in the library. Rain beat hard against the window panes, and thunder rumbled far out on the prairie like a distant warning. "Let's do one more," Caleb suggested, even though they had already gone through 12 songs. "I just want to be sure you feel steady." "I feel steady," Elena replied. But she walked into his arms all the same, because she was a fool who would take any reason to be near him. They moved without a word, the sound of the rain keeping the beat for them, and flashes of lightning would light up the room for a second in a brilliant white. Elena's skirt swirled about her ankles. Caleb's hands were warm and confident, and somewhere during that waltz the air in the room changed. They crossed a line they both knew they should not have. His hand moved up her back, pressing her body completely against his. Her fingers clenched his, not just following his lead anymore, but holding on tight. Their steps were perfectly matched now, their bodies touching from chest down to thigh, and Elena could feel his heart hammering just as hard as her own. The tune Caleb was humming died in his throat. They stopped dancing but did not pull away. "Elena," he said, and her name sounded like a warning. "I know," she breathed. "The agreement, the rule, no emotions." "No emotions," he repeated. But his hand was still on her waist, and his eyes were full of a fire that was anything but detached. "We ought to stop," Elena whispered. "We ought to," Caleb said back. But neither of them took a step. The storm grew stronger, beating on the house, like it was trying to force its way in. A loud clap of thunder was closer this time, making the windows rattle, and in the wavering light from the fireplace, with shadows from the storm moving on the walls, Elena did something that would change their entire world. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. She only meant for it to be for a second, a small moment of weakness that she would immediately regret and never do again. But the moment her lips met his, Caleb let out a low growl deep in his chest and kissed her back like a man dying of thirst in the desert. His hand balled up in the material of her dress. Her fingers got lost in his hair, and the careful wall they had kept between them for weeks crumbled into nothing. Caleb was the one to pull away, breathing hard, his face a mix of raw wanting and what looked an awful lot like fear. "We cannot," he said, his voice ragged. "Elena, we made a deal." "I know the deal we made," she answered, her own breath shaky. "And I am breaking it. I am breaking the rule." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the hard line of his jaw. "I have feelings for you, Caleb. I have had them for weeks, and I am done pretending that I do not." "Do not," he said, but it sounded more like he was begging. "Do not do this. Do not offer me something I know I cannot have." "Who says you cannot have it?" "I do." He took a step back, forcing space between them with a great deal of effort. "I cannot be that man for you, Elena. Whatever you are feeling, whatever I might be feeling, It does not make a difference. I told you what happened with Catherine. I cannot go through that again. I will not make it through. I am not Catherine, Elena said softly. I know. He let out a bitter laugh. That is what makes this so much harder. You are not anything like her. You are good and you are brave. And you always look for the good in folks, even when they do not deserve it. You make me want things that I stopped letting myself want a long time ago. He pushed both hands through his hair, messing up its neat arrangement. But wanting something does not change who I am. I am still that cold, hard man she always said I was. I am still the kind of man who will let you down in the end, who will fail you and make you wish you had never set foot in this house. That is not who you are. It is who I am, he said with a terrible finality. I have proven it time and again. Every woman I have ever been with, every friend I have ever tried to keep, it all ends the exact same way. They all figure out that I am not worth the trouble it takes to care about me. Elena felt hot tears sting her eyes, but she would not let them spill. You are wrong. You are so wrong about who you are, it just breaks my heart. Then I guess we are both broken, Caleb said, because I cannot give you what you need, and you are something I promised myself I would never want again. He started for the door, then stopped without looking back at her. Get some rest. The dance is tomorrow, and we still have a whole town to convince that we are a happy couple. He left her standing there in the library, the memory of his kiss still burning on her mouth, her heart feeling like it had split right down the middle. Elena collapsed into the closest chair, covering her mouth with her hand to keep from sobbing. She had known the terms, she had agreed to them. She had even signed her name to them. She had sworn to herself she would not be silly enough to fall for a man who had told her straight out he was unable to love her in return. But somewhere between that first careful dance step and that last wild kiss, she had lost the line between the woman she was pretending to be and the woman she was turning into. She had fallen in love with Caleb Hartwell, not the part he was playing, but the real man underneath. The man who worked until he was bone-tired to take care of his land and his people. The one who read books of poetry when he believed no one was looking. The one who had held her so gently while he taught her how to dance, like she was something precious that he was afraid to break. And now she had to find a way to get through the rest of their arrangement, knowing full well he would never feel the same way. The Henderson dance was every bit as bad as Elena had imagined. And then some. The ranch house was lit up against the dark autumn night, with music pouring out of the open windows. A long line of buggies kept arriving, dropping off guests dressed in their Sunday best. Elena was wearing a new dress, made of silk the color of dark wine that Mrs. Hartwell had managed to get for her, with little black beads that shimmered when she moved. Her hair was swept up in fancy curls held in place with pearl combs. She looked like she fit right in with all these people. But she felt like a fraud in a costume. You look beautiful, Caleb said as she walked down the stairs, but his voice was completely neutral, like the night before had been just a dream. Thank you, Elena said back, just as formally. They took the carriage to the Henderson ranch in a strange and heavy quiet. They sat a foot apart on the seat, but it might as well have been a whole county between them. Caleb kept his hands on his own knees, his eyes locked on the path ahead, and his face was a complete blank. The only sign of the storm inside him was the way his knuckles were white from gripping the reins. Caleb, Elena began, feeling like she had to say something to break the awful silence. Not now, he said under his breath. Please, I cannot. Not right now. So, downstairs. They rode to the dance without saying a word and slipped into their roles as soon as they arrived, easy as breathing. Caleb's hand settled on the small of her back. Elena smiled and said hello to the other guests. They made their way through the crowd like a single unit, all polished on the outside with nothing but a hollow ache underneath. The dancing started about an hour later, with couples spinning across the Hendersons' huge ballroom floor to a live orchestra that sounded a whole lot better than Mrs. Hartwell's piano playing. Caleb led Elena out for the first waltz, and her own body betrayed her, responding to his touch in an instant. Her pulse jumped, her breath caught, and every nerve she had suddenly felt wide awake. "Just like we practiced," he whispered, steering her through the steps they had gone over 100 times. But it was not like practice at all. Those dances had been building toward something, each one pulling them a little bit closer. These steps were careful, formal, keeping a proper space between them, as if that empty space was the only thing keeping them from falling apart. "You are doing fine," Caleb said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I have a good partner." His hand squeezed her waist just for a second. "Elena, I know," she said, cutting him off before he could say more. "I know. You do not have to say it again. I understand." She made herself look him in the eye to show him she meant every word. "We will make it through this year. We will honor the contract, and then we will both walk away, just like we planned." A shadow of what looked an awful lot like pain crossed his face, but it was gone so fast she thought she might have imagined it. "Thank you," he said, "for understanding, for not making this any harder than it has to be." The music came to an end. They moved apart with perfect— It was a show, just for appearances, and Elena let herself get pulled into conversations with the other women. Meanwhile, Caleb was off talking cattle prices and water rights with the men. Everything was polite and professional, just like their agreement laid out. And for Elena, it felt like she was slowly bleeding out. The hours went by in a haze of tight smiles and talk about nothing. Elena danced with other men, local ranchers and business partners of Morrison, who were all surely reporting back to him. She even danced with James Hartwell, who had a look in his eyes that saw right through her. "He's a fool," James said, guiding her through a country two-step. "My brother, I mean. Whatever went on between you two, he is handling it like a complete fool." "Nothing happened," Elena said, the words coming out on their own. "Sure, and I've got oceanfront property in Arizona." James spun her with an expert hand. "For what it's worth, I have never seen him look at anybody the way he looks at you. Not even Catherine, and we all figured he would lay down and die when she left him." "He looks at me like I am a business deal," Elena said, and she could not keep the bitter taste out of her words. "He looks at you like you are the sun." "And he is scared to death of getting burned," James corrected her. "There is a big difference." Before Elena could answer, the band started up a waltz, and Caleb was suddenly at her side. You could feel the tension coming off him like heat off dry pavement. "I'm cutting in," he told his brother, straight to the point. James stepped away with a grin that knew too much. "She is all yours, brother." Caleb pulled Elena into his arms, not as carefully as he had been all night. His grip was tight, so tight it felt like he was staking a claim. They moved across the floor without a word, but the air had changed between them. That polite distance was gone, and in its place was a closeness so fierce it made Elena forget how to breathe. "What did James say to you?" Caleb's voice was low with a dangerous edge to it. "Nothing important." "Do not lie to me." Elena looked up at his face and saw the mask he wore, the one that could not quite hide the fire underneath. "He said, 'You are a fool, and that you look at me like I am the sun.'" Caleb's jaw went tight. "He talks too much." "Does he? Or does he just say the things you do not want to hear?" "Elena." "No," she cut him off. "You do not get to shut me down this time. You kissed me back last night, Caleb. You kissed me like a man who was drowning and thought I was his only breath. So do not stand here and act like you feel nothing for me." "What I feel does not matter," he said, his voice rough. "What I feel has nothing to do with what I can actually give you. And what if I do not need you to give me a single thing except the truth?" She kept her voice down, knowing the other dancers were all around them. "What if the only thing I want is for you to stop hiding behind these walls you built to keep yourself from really living?" His eyes were blazing now. "You have no idea what you are asking for. Then tell me. Tell me what is so impossible about what I am asking." The music was rising, getting louder and louder. Caleb pulled her in so close his mouth was right next to her ear, and he spoke words that felt like a knife. "You are asking me to believe that I deserve to be loved, and I cannot do that. I have tried, Elena. For weeks now, I have tried to tell myself that maybe this time it could be different. That maybe you are right, and I am not the cold, broken man Catherine said I was. But I cannot get rid of that voice, the one that tells me I will eventually let you down, just like I've let down everyone else. That voice is louder than any song, any kiss, any moment of feeling something besides empty." Hearing him say it out loud broke something deep inside Elena's chest. She stopped dancing, which made him stop too. She looked right up at him with tears in her eyes that she did not try to hide anymore. "Then you are not just protecting yourself," she said softly. "You are protecting me from the trouble of loving a man who refuses to believe he is worth loving. And that is the cruelest thing you could possibly do." Before he could say a word, the song ended. A wave of polite clapping went through the ballroom. Elena stepped out of his arms and walked away. She headed straight for the veranda, hoping the cold night air would clear her head, hoping no one would see her cry. She found a dark corner behind a trellis of withered roses and just let the tears fall. She was so angry with herself for breaking the one promise she had made. She knew better. He had told her straight up how things were, and she had still been foolish enough to fall in love with a man who explained exactly why he could never love her back. "Elena." She turned and saw Caleb standing just a few feet away. The look on his face was raw, with a feeling she had never seen on him before. It was real, unguarded weakness. "Please go," she whispered. "I cannot do this right now. I cannot leave you out here crying." He stepped closer, and she saw that his hands were shaking. "Elena, I am sorry. I am so sorry for hurting you. I am sorry for being the man Catherine always said I was. I am sorry for—" "Stop," Elena said, her voice full of fire. "Stop apologizing for being hurt. Stop punishing yourself for what she did to you. Catherine was wrong, Caleb. She was cruel and she was wrong. And you have spent 6 years believing her lies because it was easier than putting your heart on the line again." "It is not easier," he said, his voice cracking. "It is torture. Every single morning, I wake up knowing you are right down the hall, knowing that you are pretending to be my wife, while I am pretending I do not want you to be my real wife. It is torture, Elena, but it is safer than what she wanted from me." "Then letting yourself be happy," Elena finished for him. "Then taking a chance that maybe, just maybe, I meant it when I said I have feelings for you. Then watching you finally realize I am not worth loving," he said. The pure fear in his voice made her heart break all over again. "Then seeing that day come when you look at me the same way she did, with disappointment and regret, and relief that you are finally free of me." Elena closed the space between them. She reached up and held his face in her hands, making him look her in the eye. "I am not Catherine," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And you are not the man she made you out to be. You are honorable and kind, and you care so much about everything that you have taught yourself not to care at all, because it hurts too much to feel things. But I see you, Caleb. I see the man you really are under all that armor you have built around yourself. And I love you anyway." He flinched like she had hit him. "Do not." "I love you," she said again, even firmer this time. "I love the way you check on your cattle every morning before the sun is even up. I love how you remember everybody's name and ask about their families. I love that you read poetry when no one is looking, and that you cannot carry a tune but you hum when we dance. I love that you are trying so hard to protect me from yourself that you would rather break both our hearts than risk being hurt again." "Elena, please." "I love you," she said, for the 3rd time. And this time her voice was fierce, like a challenge. "And you can spend the rest of this year pushing me away. You can watch me walk out that door when our time is up, just like we planned, but you cannot make me stop loving you. That train has already left the station, so you can either accept it and let yourself love me back, or you can at least do me the decency of admitting you are just too damn scared to try." Her words just hung there in the air between them, like a line drawn in the sand. Caleb just stared at her, his chest rising and falling, all his careful control finally breaking apart. She watched it happen. She saw the walls crack, the armor fall to pieces. She watched every single thing he had been holding back for so long just flood into his eyes. "I am terrified," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I am absolutely terrified of this, of you, of what I feel every single time you walk into a room. I am terrified that I will wake up one day, and you will have figured out what Catherine knew all along, that I am missing something important inside me, something that makes other people capable of a love that lasts." "You are not missing anything," Elena said. "You are just convinced that you are, and that is not the same thing at all." "How do you know?" The question sounded desperate, like a plea. "How can you possibly know that I will not hurt you?" "I do not," she said, plain and simple. "That is what makes it love, and not a business deal. It is choosing to trust someone with your heart, even when you have no guarantees, even when it is the scariest thing in the world." Thunder rumbled way off in the distance, another storm rolling in across the flatlands. The wind kicked up, sending dried rose petals dancing across the veranda floor. And in that one moment, with the sound of music drifting out from the ballroom, and the first drops of rain starting to hit the stones, Caleb made a choice. He kissed her, and it was not a careful kiss this time. There was no holding back, no polite distance. He kissed her like a man who had been trapped underwater and had finally broken through to the surface for a breath of air. His hands held her face, his body was pressed against hers, and Elena felt him finally let go. She felt the walls come crashing down. The fear was washed away by something stronger, something more honest. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. The words were rough, but they were real. "Lord help me, Elena. I have been falling in love with you since the day you signed that damned contract. Maybe even before that, when you stood in my ballroom in that old patched-up coat and refused to be scared by people who thought they were better than you." A feeling of pure joy exploded in Elena's chest, bright and sharp. "Say it again. I love you." He kissed her temple, her cheekbone, the corner of her mouth. "I love you, and I'm scared to death. And I have no idea how to do this without a set of rules and a contract to hide behind, but I am willing to try if you are." "I am willing," Elena said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I have been willing for weeks, you stubborn man." He kissed her again, slower this time, a deep and certain kiss that laid a claim on her. His hand slid down her back, pulling her even closer. Elena felt all the tension that had been between them for weeks finally change into something else, something that could last, something real. "We should probably go back inside," Caleb whispered against her lips, "before folks start to notice we are gone." "Let them notice," Elena said, feeling reckless and free. "Let them see that we are really married and really in love. No more pretending." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes full of wonder and the last bits of his fear. "What about the contract, the agreement?" "Tear it up," Elena said. "I do not want your money or your shop or any of the things we settled on. I just want you, the real you, not this act." "You will have me," he promised. "All of me, even the busted parts, especially the busted parts because you are the only one who has ever made me think they might not be broken after all." They stood there together in the rain, holding each other while the storm got stronger, and Elena thought about rules and contracts and the careful space they had kept between them for weeks. She thought about how sometimes you need walls to be safe, but you need doors to truly live. Caleb had finally opened his, and Elena was walking right through without a second thought, picking love over being safe, picking him over every sensible reason her practical mind could come up with. It was reckless. It was scary. It was exactly right. When they got back to the ballroom, soaked from the rain, holding hands tight, everyone could see the difference. Something deep down had changed between them, turning the pretense into the truth. The whispering started right away. People wondering what happened out on that porch. Why Caleb Hartwell was looking at his wife like she was the answer to questions he had given up on years ago. Let them whisper, Elena thought. Let them wonder. She was done hiding how she felt, done pretending their deal was anything less than the most real thing in her life. They danced one last time before they left. And this dance was not like the others. There was no measured distance, no careful performance, just two people moving as one, finally being honest about what was between them. "What happens now?" Elena asked as they swayed. "I do not know," Caleb admitted. "But we will figure it out together. No more contracts. No more contracts," he agreed. "Just us. Just this. Just love," Elena thought. Complicated and terrifying and worth every single risk. The rule was broken, and neither one of them had ever been happier about breaking something in their entire lives. That happiness lasted for exactly 3 days. 3 days of waking up with Caleb's arms around her, of drinking coffee in the morning with real smiles instead of practiced ones, of dancing in the library just because they felt like it, not because they had to practice. 3 days of Elena starting to believe that love just might be enough, that tearing down the walls was the hard part, and everything that came after would be easy. She should have known better. The first crack showed up at breakfast on the 4th morning. Caleb was reading the territorial newspaper, and the look on his face got darker and darker until he suddenly slammed the paper down on the table, making the plates and silverware jump. "That son of a—" He stopped himself, glancing over at his mother and Elena. "Apologies, but Morrison has really outdone himself this time." "What is it?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, her voice suggesting she already had a good idea. "He has filed a formal complaint with the territorial court. He is demanding an investigation into fraudulent marriage claims. Says he has proof that our marriage license was backdated, that we bribed the officials, that this whole thing is a scheme to defraud the Fairfax family." Caleb's jaw was clenched so tight Elena could see the muscle twitching. "He is asking the court to declare the marriage void and charge us both with fraud." Elena's stomach felt like it dropped to the floor. "Can he do that?" "He can sure try," Caleb said with a grim look. "And if he gets the right judge, the right political—" "Have you ever been backed into a corner so tight you would do anything to get out, only to find you made things a whole lot worse?" That is where Caleb Hartwell was, and the woman he loved, Elena, was trapped right there with him. This is a story about how fear can make a good man do a foolish thing, and whether love is strong enough to clean up the mess. Stick with me to see if they can find a way out. Morrison has been gunning for this since the engagement party. He has got connections all over this part of the state. Mrs. Hartwell placed her teacup on its saucer with a delicate click. "Then we will fight him. We will hire the best lawyers in Texas. And we will lose," Caleb cut in, his voice hard. "Because he is right, Mama. The license was faked. The witnesses were paid off. Every single thing he is accusing us of, well, we did it." He glanced at Elena, and under all that anger she saw a deep, terrifying fear. If this thing goes to trial, Elena could face criminal charges, jail time. And her good name will be dragged through the mud all over the county. "Then we tell people the truth," Elena said, her voice sounding far braver than she felt. "We explain why we did it, that we were just trying to save you from a marriage you never wanted, that nobody actually got hurt." "The truth just digs the hole deeper," Caleb said, his tone flat. "The truth is, we cooked up a scheme to commit fraud, used fake papers, and lied to this whole town. The fact that we fell for each other later on does not change what we did to get here." The words just hung there in the quiet room, heavy as a storm cloud. A chill went right through Elena's bones, even with the warm morning sun pouring through the glass. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb went to the window, his back ramrod straight. "I am saying I made a terrible mistake. I thought I was smart enough to outfox Morrison. Thought I could save the ranch and my own hide with a clever little lie. Instead, I put you square in the line of fire. You who had no part in any of this mess, who just came here looking for an honest job." He pressed his hand against the cool window pane. "I have ruined you just to save myself, and I do not know how to live with that. Caleb, do not." He turned around, and his face was so blank, so carefully empty, it made Elena's heart skip a beat. She knew that look. The walls were going right back up. "I need to think. I need to figure a way out of this that does not pull you down with me." He walked out without another word. His breakfast sat on the table untouched, his coffee getting cold in the mug. Mrs. Hartwell reached over and put her hand on Elena's. "Just give him some time," she said gently. "When Caleb gets scared, he pulls into his shell. It is the only way he knows how to handle the things life has thrown at him." "But I am not Catherine," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. "I am not going to run off just because things got hard. I know that, dear. But does he?" That question followed Elena all day long. Caleb was gone for lunch. He never showed up for supper. She finally found him long after the sun went down, out in the barn. He was sitting on a bale of hay, just staring off into space with a half-gone bottle of whiskey next to him. "Tying one on all by your lonesome," she said softly, just to let him know she was there. "That is not your style. Maybe you do not know me as well as you think you do." His words were not slurred, but they were heavy with whiskey and a lack of hope. Elena sat down next to him, keeping a little space between them. "Tell me what is on your mind." "I am thinking I should have just let Morrison shove me into that marriage with Margaret. It would have been simpler, safer. Nobody would have gotten hurt but me, and hell, I am used to that." He took another long swallow. "Instead, I pulled you right into my disaster, made you a part of my plan, and now you are the one looking at jail time because I was too much of a coward to face my own problems." That is not how it happened. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were just empty. "I saw you in that ballroom looking lost and alone, and I used you. I told myself I was doing us both a favor, but the truth is I just grabbed the first way out I saw, and did not give a damn what it might cost you." "I made my own decision," Elena said, her voice firm. "I knew what I was getting into. I signed that paper with my eyes wide open. You signed it because you were at the end of your rope. You had debts you could not handle, a sister who counted on you, and no other place to go." His laugh was harsh. "I took advantage of you being in a tight spot, called it a business deal, and told myself I was some kind of gentleman. But I was not. I was just being selfish." A hot anger started to burn through Elena's fear. "So what is your big plan now? Push me out? Put those walls back up that you just took down? Prove Catherine right by turning into the same cold, shut-down man she always said you were? My plan is to keep you safe from what I have done." He set the whiskey bottle down carefully. "Morrison's lawyer paid a visit this afternoon while you were out for a ride. He made an offer." A cold knot of dread formed in Elena's stomach. "What kind of offer?" "If I agree to annul the marriage, tell everyone we committed fraud, and take all the penalties, which means some heavy fines and limits on the ranch's business. Then Morrison will drop every charge against you. Your name will be clean. You will walk out of this with the money I already gave you and a clean slate." "And what about you?" "I will be ruined," Caleb said plainly. "My reputation shot, the business crippled. I will probably have to sell off a good piece of the ranch to pay for it all. But you will be safe. That is all that matters." "No." Elena got to her feet, her hands balled into tight fists. "Absolutely not. We are going to fight this together." "There is no together," Caleb said. His voice was so empty, so devoid of feeling, it stole the air from her lungs. "There is you, with your entire life in front of you. And there is me, paying the price for what I did. That is how this is going to end. That is how you are choosing for it to end," Elena shot back, a war of anger and heartbreak raging inside her. "You are choosing to lay down and quit. You are choosing to believe you are not good enough to be happy, choosing to shove away the only person on this earth who loves you, because taking that love would take a kind of grit you do not think you have. He flinched at that, but he did not fight her on it. 3 days ago, you told me you loved me, Elena went on, her voice trembling. You kissed me out in the rain, and you promised we would sort this all out together. Was that all just a lie? Or do you really run this fast when the going gets tough? This is not running, Caleb said softly. It is facing facts. It was a mistake for me to fall in love with you, Elena. Not because you are not worth loving. Lord knows you are worth more than a man like me could ever deserve. But because loving me has put you in harm's way. The best thing I can do for you now is to let you go before Morrison tears you apart. The kindest thing you could do is trust that I can make my own decisions about the chances I am willing to take. Elena's hands were shaking now, her whole body trembling with feelings too big to hold in. But you cannot do that, can you? Because trusting me would mean you would have to believe I might actually stick around. And you are so damn sure you are not worth loving that you will wreck anything good in your life just to prove you were right all along. Maybe I am, he said, getting up to face her. Maybe I am just that busted up inside. But busted up or not, I am not going to let Morrison ruin you to get back at me. Tomorrow morning, I am signing that deal. This marriage will be over. Marriage. You will get everything we agreed on in the beginning, plus some extra for the trouble I have put you through. I do not want your money, Elena cried, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I want you. I want us. I want the life we were supposed to have. If you would just stop being so scared of being happy for once, then you want the one thing I cannot give you. His face looked like it was chiseled out of rock. Any trace of the man she knew was locked up tight behind walls so high she could not see over them. I am sorry, Elena. I truly am. But this is the only way it can end. He walked right past her and out of the barn, leaving her all alone in the dark. The only thing left was the smell of hay and horses, and the sound of her own heart shattering. Elena collapsed back on the hay bale, buried her face in her hands, and just let the tears come. For 3 whole days, she had believed in a fresh start. She believed that love could patch up old hurts, that picking courage over fear actually meant something. But Caleb was picking fear. He was choosing to believe Morrison's empty threats instead of her promises. He was choosing to save her from a fight she was more than willing to take on, as long as she was next to him. She had told him over and over that she was not Catherine, but in the end he treated her just like he expected Catherine to act. He assumed she would leave him sooner or later. So he was leaving her first. Making it a clean break, making it hurt, making damn sure he would never have to feel the pain of being left behind again. And the most awful part of it all was that she understood. She could see the twisted sense it made inside his wounded heart. She saw how every bad thing that had ever happened to him had taught him the same lesson. Love does not last. People always leave. And trusting someone with your heart is just asking for it to get broken. She understood it completely. She just refused to accept it. Elena wiped at her tears with trembling hands and walked back toward the main house. Mrs. Hartwell was already in the kitchen, a look on her face that said she knew everything. He told you, she stated, not even asking. He told me he's quitting, Elena corrected her. He's signing Morrison's papers, ending our marriage, and giving up everything just to keep me safe from trouble I am more than willing to face. Mrs. Hartwell let out a long, tired breath, and for a moment she looked all of her 60 years. That boy, her stubborn, self-destructing son. She pulled a chair out from the table and motioned for Elena to have a seat. Let me tell you a little something about my son. His father, my husband, was a hard man. He was not cruel, but he had high expectations. He wanted Caleb to be strong, quiet, and never shaken. When Caleb was just 8 years old, his favorite horse broke its leg. He cried, and his father punished him for it. He said men do not cry over animals. That kind of weakness will get you killed out here. She poured the tea with hands that never shook. From that day on, Caleb learned how to bury every single thing he felt. He became the perfect son, the perfect rancher, the perfect man. And when Catherine broke his heart, it just proved what he had always been taught to believe. That showing your soft spots, needing another person, or letting yourself feel anything too strong, it all just leads to pain. So now he is choosing to take the pain his own way. Elena said, "Pain that he can control." Exactly. And I just do not know how to get through to him anymore. Mrs. Hartwell's voice started to crack. I have watched him empty himself out for years, just surviving instead of living. And right when I started to think you might be the one to bring him back, she just shook her head. Morrison knew exactly what he was doing. He knew threatening you would make Caleb fold. This is not about the ranch or the money or even what people think of him. It is about making Caleb hurt the ones he loves before they get a chance to hurt him. Then Morrison gets everything he wants, Elena said, the bitterness sharp in her voice. Unless you decide to fight for him. Elena's head snapped up. He does not want me to fight. He told me to take the easy way out and leave. He wants you to prove him right, Mrs. Hartwell corrected gently. He wants you to walk away just like Catherine did so he can tell himself he was right all along, that it was never going to last. But what if you do not give him that satisfaction? What if you stay right here and fight, not just for him but for the both of you? How can I? He has already made his decision. Then you have to change it. Mrs. Hartwell reached her hands across the table and took hold of Elena's. You love my son. I have seen it in the way your eyes follow him, the way you have so carefully and gently helped him learn how to feel things again. Do not you dare give up on him now. Not when he needs you the most, even if he is too stubborn and scared to see it for himself. Elena wanted to. Every single part of her wanted to fight for Caleb, for them, and for the life she knew they could have with each other. But she was just so tired of fighting, so tired of having to be brave, and so tired of loving a man who seemed dead set on pushing her away for her own good. I do not know if I have the strength, she whispered. You have the strength, Mrs. Hartwell said with a certainty that could move mountains. You made it through being poor, through loss, through hard times, and you came out on the other side with a heart still big enough to love. You are exactly strong enough. The real question is, do you believe you deserve to fight for your own happiness? Those words hit her like a bolt of lightning. Elena had spent so much of her time wondering if Caleb believed he deserved to be loved, that she never once stopped to ask if she believed she deserved to be loved back, if she believed her own happiness was something worth fighting for, especially when the man she loved was the one telling her to leave. What should I do? Elena asked. Tomorrow morning, Caleb is meeting with Morrison's lawyer to sign those papers. You have from now until then to change his mind. Or you can accept his choice and walk away. Mrs. Hartwell gave her hands one last squeeze before letting go. But Elena, if you do decide to leave, you make sure it is because you chose it, not because he talked you into believing you were not worth the fight. Elena spent a night without sleep, tossing between being furious and heartbroken, making up speeches in her head and then throwing them out, trying to figure out how to reach a man who had locked himself behind walls he had built with years of pain and disappointment. When the sun came up, she still did not have the perfect answer. But she was clear on one thing. She was not about to let Caleb make this decision for the both of them all by himself without her getting one final word in. She found him in his study at first light. He was already dressed in his town suit with papers spread all over his desk. He looked up when she came in, and for a split second, something that looked like relief washed over his face before he shut it down. Elena, I figured you would be asleep. I could not sleep knowing you were about to make the biggest mistake of your entire life, she said, and she closed the door behind her. We need to talk. There is nothing left to talk about. I am meeting Morrison's lawyer at 8 o'clock. The decision has been made. Your decision, Elena corrected him, not our decision. You are deciding my future for me without even asking me what I want. I know what you want. Caleb said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. You want us to fight Morrison together, face whatever comes our way, and stand against the whole world. It is romantic, it is brave, and it is also a fool's dream. What is foolish about two people refusing to let some bully run their lives? What is foolish is thinking that love is enough to win the day, he said. And there was so much tiredness in his voice that Elena's anger started to fade. Morrison has power, money, and powerful friends. He has judges in his back pocket and lawyers who will keep us tied up in court for years to come. Even if we fight and by some miracle we win, the price will be too high. Legal bills, lost business, years of worrying and not knowing. And all that time, you would be stuck with me, unable to get on with your life, just watching me get slowly crushed by a mess that I made. You are not giving me enough credit for knowing what I am getting into, Elena said. I am giving you a chance to choose something else. Caleb stood up and walked around the desk until he was standing right in front of her. Elena, I love you. I meant every word of that, but love does not change the facts. The fact is, I put you in danger with my plans. The fact is, Morrison will ruin you just to hurt me unless I give him what he wants. The fact is, letting you go right now while you still have a future is the most loving thing I can possibly do. The most loving thing you can do is to trust me, Elena said, her voice filled with desperation. Trust that I know the risk I am taking. Trust that I am strong enough to handle whatever storm comes our way. Trust that I love you enough to stay, even when things get hard. I cannot, he said, just like that. And the plain honesty in those two words shattered her heart. I cannot trust that you will stay because sooner or later, everybody leaves. Catherine left. My daddy died and left me with more responsibility than any 19-year-old boy should have to handle. Friends I thought I could count on took Morrison's side when it was the easier thing to do. I have learned that folks are loyal right up until it costs them something, and then they are gone. I will not. I cannot watch you realize that loving me costs too much and then see that moment when you decide to leave. So, you are leaving first, Elena said, as tears finally started streaming down her face. You choose to stay by, forcing me away before I even get the chance to prove you wrong. I'm setting you free, Caleb corrected her, but his own voice was thick with feelings he was trying to hide. Before it is too late, before Morrison ruins you, before you waste years of your life on a man who is too broken to ever give you the simple, happy love you deserve. Elena looked at the man she loved so much, saw the tears he was fighting so hard not to shed, saw the way his hand was shaking as he stood there trying to be strong enough to send her away. And she finally understood that no argument was going to reach him, no speech was going to change his mind. He had decided what had to be done, and his stubborn, self-sacrificing pride would not let him see any other way. You are right, she said quietly, and she watched the shock spread across his face. What? You are right. You are too broken to give me a simple love. You are too scared to trust that I might actually stay. You are too convinced that you are not worth it to accept that someone could love you with all your flaws and all your mistakes. She stepped closer and laid one hand right over his heart. But here is the one thing you are wrong about. I do not want a simple love. I do not want a man who has never been broken. I want you, scared and flawed and convinced you are going to let me down. I want you fighting through that fear to choose love anyway. I want you to trust me even when it scares you half to death. That is what real love is. Caleb knew courage was not about being fearless, but about acting in spite of that fear. He took her hand and held it flat against his chest, right where his heart was pounding like a drum. Caleb, I am leaving now, she said, her voice holding steady even with tears in her eyes. I am going to pack my bag and be gone from here before you ever meet with Morrison's lawyer. This is not because you are forcing me out, but because I'm choosing to go. I am choosing to show you what it feels like when someone actually leaves, so you understand the difference between that and someone fighting to stay. She stood up on her tiptoes and gave him a soft kiss on the cheek. When you are ready to stop being a coward, when you are ready to believe that love is worth the risk, you know right where to find me. But I will not wait forever, Caleb. Sooner or later, even the people who love you the most run out of chances to give. She pulled back from him and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob, giving him one last chance to stop her, to choose a different path, to be brave enough to fight for them. He said nothing. Elena left the study, climbed the stairs to her room, and packed her one little bag with the same worn clothes she had arrived in months ago. She left behind the beautiful dresses Mrs. Hartwell had given her. She left the pearl combs and the silk stockings. She left everything she had gained, wanting nothing from this house except for the man who was too afraid to let himself be loved. Mrs. Hartwell found her in the hallway. "You are leaving." "I am forcing his hand," Elena said. "He needs to understand what he is choosing, what he is losing. And if he lets you go, then I will know I tried everything." Elena hugged the older woman tight. "Thank you for believing I was worth fighting for, even when your own son could not. He will realize," Mrs. Hartwell said with fire in her voice. "He is stubborn, but he is not a fool. He will realize what he has lost, and he will come for you." "I hope you're right," Elena said as she picked up her bag. "But I'm done hoping he will change. He has to want to change. He has to want me enough to face his fear." She walked down that grand staircase for the last time, through the entrance hall where this whole complicated mess had started, and out the front door into the morning sun. The stagecoach to Denver was not leaving until the afternoon, but she would walk to town if she had to. Anything to be gone before Caleb signed away their marriage, their future, and their one chance at happiness. Behind her, the house stood silent. No one ran after her. No voice called her back. Elena just kept walking, her heart breaking a little more with every single step, and she prayed that leaving was the one thing that would finally make Caleb understand what he was too afraid to fight for. Inside his study, Caleb stood at the window and watched her go. He watched her walk down that long drive with her worn-out bag, her back held straight, and her complete certainty that he was making a terrible mistake. A part of him wanted to run right after her. It wanted to beg her to stay. It wanted to be brave enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, she meant it when she said she would weather any storm to be with him. But the bigger part of him, the part that had been hurt too many times, stayed rooted to the spot. It let her go. It told himself it was for the best, convinced himself that he was protecting her, even as his own heart was shattering into pieces that might never be whole again. At precisely 8 o'clock, Morrison's lawyer arrived. Caleb signed the papers with a steady hand and agreed to terms that would damage his business for years. He accepted the complete destruction of his reputation in exchange for Elena's safety. The lawyer left, completely satisfied. Morrison had won. And Caleb just sat in his empty study in his empty house with his empty heart and wondered if protecting someone from yourself could be called love when it felt exactly like dying. The ranch just felt wrong without her. Caleb noticed it right away. The silence at breakfast, the empty chair sitting across from him, the way his coffee tasted bitter even though it was made the same way as always. He told himself it was a temporary discomfort, that he would get used to it, that he had made the right choice, even if it hurt like hell. He was wrong on all counts. 3 days after Elena left, he still found himself turning to share something with her before remembering she was not there. 5 days in, he caught himself humming the waltz they had danced to, then stopped cold when he realized what he was doing. A week after she was gone, he had stopped sleeping completely. He would just lie awake in his bed, knowing she was just down the hall. Except she was not. Not anymore. And the connecting door between their rooms stood open like a constant accusation. Mrs. Hartwell watched him with more and more frustration, finally confronting him at dinner on the 8th night. "You look awful," she said, not mincing any words. "Thank you, Mother. Your concern is touching. My concern is that you are dying by inches and are too stubborn to admit you made a mistake." She set down her fork with a sharp click. "Elena is gone. You got exactly what you claimed you wanted. So why do you look like you are attending your own funeral? I am fine. You are miserable. You have not eaten a proper meal in a week. You work yourself to exhaustion every single day and you still cannot sleep at night. The ranch hands are starting to get worried. They say you are distracted, making mistakes you would never normally make. She leaned forward, her expression fierce. You saved her from Morrison's threats, Caleb. Congratulations. Now the both of you are suffering. Her in Denver, all alone with a broken heart. And you, here, slowly destroying yourself trying to pretend you do not care. I do care, Caleb said quietly. That is why I let her go. No, you let her go because you are a coward. The word hit him like a physical blow. Caleb's hands clenched on his napkin. I protected her. From what? From loving you? From choosing to stand by you through hard times? From having any say in her own life? His mother's voice rose with anger. You did not protect her, Caleb. You made her decisions for her, just like Morrison tried to make your decisions for you. You became the very thing you were fighting against. That is not fair. Life is not fair, and neither is love. Elena knew the risks. She chose you anyway. And instead of honoring that choice, you threw it back in her face and told her she was not capable of deciding what she could handle. Mrs. Hartwell stood up, her napkin falling to the floor. Your father would be ashamed of you, not for falling in love, not for making mistakes, but for being too afraid to fight for your own happiness. She left him sitting there all alone at the dining table, her words bouncing off the walls of the empty room. Caleb stared at his untouched food and felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the armor he had built so carefully over the years. Had he really become like Morrison, taking away Elena's choice, deciding what was best for her without ever asking what she wanted? He pushed away from the table and went back to his study, the one room where he had always been able to think clearly. But tonight, even this sanctuary felt wrong. He saw the chair where Elena had sat while they were building their complicated lie. He saw the desk where they had signed the contract. He saw the space near the fireplace where she had stood and told him she loved him, so brave and certain, while he had been terrified and filled with doubt. Caleb walked to that spot now, pressing his hand against the cool stone of the fireplace, and he let himself really think about what he had done. He had told himself he was protecting Elena, that he was being noble, sacrificing his own happiness for her safety. But standing there, in the very place where she had offered him everything and he had been too scared to take it, Caleb could see the truth his mother had laid bare. He had not been protecting Elena. He had been protecting himself, because if Elena had stayed, if they had fought Morrison together and won, then Caleb would have had to believe he deserved happiness. He would have had to trust that someone could know all his flaws, all his failures, all the ways he was broken, and still choose to love him anyway. He would have had to risk being vulnerable again, knowing that vulnerability had destroyed him once before. It was easier and safer to push her away first, to tell himself he was being selfless when he was really just being afraid. Catherine had been wrong about many things, but she had been right about one. Caleb was rigid. He held himself to impossible standards, never forgave himself for mistakes, and built walls so high that even people who wanted to love, no one could find a way to get to him. For 6 years, he had proven her right, turning into the exact cold and closed-off man she had accused him of being. But then Elena had walked into his life. Elena saw past all his walls and found the lonely, frightened man underneath. She challenged him to be brave, to feel and to trust again. She loved him, not in spite of his broken pieces, but because she understood them. She had her own scars and knew that broken things could still be beautiful. He had everything he had ever secretly dreamed of, and he threw it all away. Accepting it all required more courage than he thought he had. That realization brought Caleb to his knees. He sank right down onto the floor with his back against the fireplace. He had been a coward. His mother was right. Elena had been right. He had chosen fear over love, safety over taking a chance, and emptiness over the terrifying idea of true joy. And now, she was gone. She believed he did not love her enough to fight for her. She believed she was not worth the risk. She believed she was just one more person he would eventually push away, because letting anyone get close was too dangerous. He had done the very same thing Catherine had done. He made Elena feel like she was not enough, not worth the effort, and not worth fighting for. The thought made him sick to his stomach. Caleb had no idea how long he sat there on the floor of his study, fighting with truths he had avoided for years. But in the end, the desperate need to fix what he had broken finally pulled him to his feet. He walked to his desk, took out a pen and paper with shaking hands, and started to write. It was not a business letter. There were no careful, measured words meant to keep his distance. It was just the raw, honest truth poured onto the page with the desperation of a man who finally understood what he was losing. He wrote about his fear. He wrote about Catherine's betrayal and how it had convinced him that he was fundamentally unlovable. He wrote about building walls to keep the pain out, only to realize too late that he had also locked himself inside. He wrote about meeting Elena, and how she had somehow slipped past every single one of his defenses without even trying. He wrote about falling in love with her despite his terror, and about those 3 perfect days when he let himself believe that happiness was possible. He wrote about the morning Morrison's threat gave him an excuse to retreat into the safety of being alone. He wrote that he now understood he had not been protecting her at all. He had been protecting himself from the possibility of being hurt again. He wrote about recognizing that pushing away the woman he loved to avoid pain had caused much more pain than taking the risk ever could have. And he wrote that he was sorry, a desperate and complete kind of sorry, for making her feel like she was not enough. The truth was, she was everything, and he had been too broken to see it. The sun was coming up by the time Caleb finished. His hand ached from writing so much. His eyes burned from being tired and from tears he had not shed. But the letter was done. It was messy and emotional, nothing like the careful letters he usually wrote, but it was completely honest. He sealed it, wrote Elena's address in Denver on the envelope, and then sat staring at it for a long time. A letter was not enough. Words on a page could not undo the damage he had done. But it was a start. No, a letter was a coward's way out. If he was finally going to be brave, if he was going to fight for the woman he loved, he needed to do it in person. He had to look her square in the eyes and tell her he was wrong. He owed her the choice he had stolen, the chance to either walk away for good or give him another shot, knowing full well the kind of busted, spooked man she would be getting. Caleb got to his feet, the decision finally settling into hard action. He would ride to Denver, he would find Elena, and he would pour out everything in his heart that fear had kept padlocked for so long. And if she said it was too late, that the hurt ran too deep, that she could not trust him not to bolt again, well, he would have to live with that. But he sure as heck was not going to accept it without putting up a fight first. He was still gripping the letter, about to head upstairs and throw some things in a bag, when the door to his study flew open. James was standing there, winded like he had run a mile, with a look of pure urgency on his face. "Caleb, you have to get to town right now. I am actually just heading for Denver." "No, you need to get to town," James cut him off. "Morrison is serving papers on the ranch, on Mother, on every single business you work with. He is not finished trying to ruin you. He is coming after it all, and everyone tied to you." A cold dread snaked its way through Caleb's gut. What kind of papers? Liens, injunctions, claims of business interference? He is using every trick in the law books to tie a noose around this ranch, and he is doing it right now while you are too broken up to fight back. James grabbed his shoulder. "You need to ride into town. You need to see our lawyer. You need to figure out how to stop this. If you do not move now, Morrison will own half this ranch before the week is out." The timing was a low blow. Caleb knew it. Morrison had waited until Elena was gone, until Caleb had signed that damned agreement, until he was at his lowest point, and then he struck with a cold, perfect aim. "Damn him to hell," Caleb whispered. "So you are coming?" Caleb glanced down at the letter in his hand, then looked back at his brother. Going into town meant putting off his trip to Denver. It meant making Elena wait even longer, wondering if he was ever going to come for her. But if he did not deal with this new assault from Morrison, there would not be a ranch to bring her back to, no future to offer her, even if she did decide to give him that second chance. "I will come," he said. But James, the minute we get this handled, I am riding for Denver. I do not care if it takes days. I do not care if I have to fight Morrison from the back of my horse the entire way. James broke into a grin. It is about time you started fighting for something more than just staying alive. They rode into town together, getting to the territorial courthouse by the middle of the morning. Their lawyer, a sharp old fella named Harrison, was already there. He had papers laid out all over a table and a grim look on his face. Morrison is thorough. I will give the devil his due, Harrison said instead of hello. He is claiming you broke the terms of your agreement by using ranch money for personal reasons during your sham marriage. He says you owe him for every meal Elena ate, every stitch of clothing she wore, every minute a staff member spent looking after her. It is inventive, it is petty, and it just might stick in court. How much? Caleb asked. By his math, about $40,000. The number was a punch to the gut. It would not bankrupt Caleb completely, but it would cripple the ranch for years. It would mean selling off land, letting good men go, and scaling back every single thing his father had built. He cannot be serious, James said. Oh, he is dead serious, and unless you can prove that marriage was real, that Elena was your actual wife and not just part of some scheme to defraud him, he is going to win. Harrison gave Caleb a sympathetic look. You went and signed a paper saying the marriage was a sham. That piece of paper gives Morrison all the ammunition he needs. Caleb just collapsed into a chair, feeling the full weight of his foolishness. He had tried to shield Elena, but all he did was hand Morrison the very club to beat him with. The ranch, all his hard-working folks and their families, his own mother's future. Everything was teetering on the brink of disaster because Caleb had been too yellow-bellied to stand and fight when it counted. There's got to be some way out of this mess, he mumbled. There is, a voice called out from the doorway. But I reckon you are not going to like it one bit. Caleb's head jerked up. Elena was standing right there in the courthouse entrance. She wore that same faded blue dress from the day she left, her hair a mess from the journey, but her face was set with pure determination. What in the world are you doing here? He demanded, jumping up so fast the chair legs screamed against the wooden floor. I am here to save you from your own damn self, Elena said, striding into the room with the certainty of a woman who had made up her mind for good. Again. Elena, you can't be here. Morrison will do what? Try to ruin me? He already took his best shot at that. She walked over to the table and looked over Harrison's papers with a sharp eye. Let me take a wild guess. He is using Caleb's confession to try and claim damages from the ranch. That is the long and short of it, Harrison confirmed, his eyes darting between the two of them with clear curiosity. But if you are here, and if you are willing to swear the marriage was real, that could give us a foundation to fight back. I will do you one better than just swearing to it, Elena cut in. She dug into her worn satchel and pulled out a folded paper. I brought our original agreement, the one nobody on earth knows about except for you and me. The very one that proves we started this as a business deal, a deal we both honored, and one that turned into a real marriage down the line. Caleb just stared at her, stunned. You kept that thing? Of course I kept it. I kept every last scrap. Your letters, the papers showing the money transfers, even the receipts for things we bought for our arrangement. Elena looked him square in the eye, and he could see pure steel behind her gentle gaze. I am a seamstress, Caleb. My whole life has been about making pieces fit together, mending tears and strengthening weak seams. Did you honestly believe I would not keep careful records of a contract worth thousands of dollars? But showing him that contract proves Morrison's whole case, Harrison pointed out. It proves the marriage was a fraud from the start. No, Elena corrected him firmly. It proves the marriage started as a business arrangement, which is perfectly legal. Marriages of convenience happen every day. For land, for money, for a better place in society. The law does not ask for love, just for proper consent and the right paperwork. She turned back to Caleb. We had both. We made a legal deal. We held up our ends of the bargain, and then, completely separate from all the business, We fell in love. That is not fraud. That is just life." Harrison started nodding his head slowly. "Well, I will be. She is right. If we can prove the first deal was made in good faith by both of you, with no intent to deceive the court, then Morrison's claim of fraud just falls apart. The marriage might have had a strange beginning, but it was always legal." "But the backdated license," Caleb began to say, "was a mistake we made because we were panicked, not because we were trying to commit some malicious fraud," Elena finished for him. "We were just trying to make the papers match up with the truth after the fact. It was foolish, and maybe not strictly by the book, but it was not fraud meant to hurt anyone, especially since we started living as a real husband and wife right after." She looked straight at Harrison. "Can you work with that?" "I can absolutely work with that," Harrison said, a new excitement rising in his voice, "as long as Mrs. Hartwell is willing to testify." "I am willing," Elena stated, her voice firm as an oak tree. "I will testify, I will show the contract, and I will explain our deal to anyone who will listen. I am willing to stand up in that courtroom and tell the whole world that I married Caleb Hartwell for business and then stayed married to him for love." She turned to Caleb then, and her voice went soft. "I am willing to fight, Caleb. The only question is, are you?" Caleb felt a lump in his throat so big he could not speak. Elena was here, standing right in front of him, risking her good name, her safety, everything she had built since she left. She was willing to fight for them even after he had been too much of a coward to fight for himself. "Why?" he finally choked out. "After everything I said to you, everything I did, why would you ever come back?" "Because someone very wise told me once that even broken things can still be beautiful," Elena said. "And because I love you, even when you are being a complete fool. In fact, especially when you are being a fool, because that is when you need someone to love you the most." She stepped closer, closing the small space between them. "I left to make you feel what it was like to lose me, to force you to understand the choice you were making. Did it work?" "It worked," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out and grabbed her hands, holding them like they were the only things keeping him from drowning. "Elena, I was coming for you this morning. Before James even showed up, I was packing my saddlebags to ride to Denver. I was coming to tell you I was sorry, that I was wrong, that I was too scared to fight for us. But I am not scared anymore." He pulled the crumpled letter from his pocket. "I wrote you this. I was up all night trying to find the right words to explain why I had been such a coward, why I pushed away the single best thing that ever happened to me." Elena took the letter. As her eyes moved over the first few sentences, tears began to stream down her cheeks. "You were really coming for me. I really was. I finally understood what you had been trying to tell me all along. That loving you did not mean I had to be perfect or brave. It just meant I had to show up, to choose you every single day, even when I'm scared. Especially when I'm scared." He reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I am still scared, Elena. I am terrified, to be honest. But I'm a whole lot more terrified of living a life without you than I am of risking my heart again." "Good," Elena said, a laugh bubbling up through her tears. "Because I am terrified too. But we can be terrified together." James cleared his throat with a loud rumble. "This is all very touching, it truly is. But we have got a legal fight to plan and a man named Morrison to bring down. Can you two save the reunion for a little later?" Elena laughed, a sound so bright and real it filled the room. "He is right. We have got work to do." They spent the next 3 hours with Harrison, plotting their counterattack. Elena's contract was the solid foundation, the proof that their arrangement was an honest deal with clear terms. You combined that with testimony from Mrs. Hartwell about how their affection had grown, statements from ranch hands who had seen their relationship change with their own eyes, and the simple fact that Caleb had honored every part of the original deal. They had a rock-solid case that their marriage was legitimate in every way that mattered to the law. Morrison built his whole strategy on you being too broken to put up a fight, Harrison explained. He figured Caleb would stay defeated, and Elena would stay gone. The two of you showing up here, standing together and ready to tell the whole truth, it pulls the rug right out from under him. When can we file? Caleb asked, eager. I can have our response drawn up by morning. We will file a counterclaim. Abuse of the legal process, harassment, interfering with business. We will make Morrison defend himself for a change, instead of him always being the one on the attack. Harrison grinned wide. This is going to be mighty satisfying. They walked out of the courthouse as the long afternoon shadows stretched across the town square. Caleb held tight to Elena's hand, half afraid she might just vanish if he let go. They walked in a heavy silence toward the spot where James had their horses hitched, the air thick with all the words they still needed to say. Finally, Caleb stopped and turned Elena to face him. I do not deserve you, he said, his voice low. I do not deserve you to forgive me, to fight for me, or to love me. But I am asking for all of it anyway, because I'm finally selfish enough to want to be happy, more than I want to hide from getting hurt. You are not selfish, Elena said gently. You are human. You are flawed and scared and just doing the best you can, like the rest of us. I hurt you. You did, she agreed. And if you do it again, if you turn tail and run the next time things get tough, I will not come back. I love you, Caleb, but I am not going to spend my life trailing after a man who will not plant his boots long enough to be loved. Her face was dead serious now. All the lightness had vanished. If we are going to do this, if we make this marriage real in every single way, you have to give me your word you will stay. Not because everything is easy, but because we are worth all the hard work. I promise, Caleb said, and he meant it with his whole heart and soul. I promise to stay, to put up a fight, to choose us even when I am scared out of my mind. I promise to trust you when you tell me you love me, even when that little voice in my head says I am not worthy of it. I promise to be brave enough to let my guard down, because that is what real love asks of you. Elena smiled, and it was like the sun coming up over the prairie. Then we have ourselves a deal, Mr. Hartwell. No more deals, Caleb said, pulling her in close. No more contracts or arrangements or haggling, just love. The messy, complicated, terrifying, and beautiful kind of love. He kissed her right then and there in the middle of town. Not caring who was watching, not caring about reputations, or what was proper, or anything at all, except for the woman in his arms who had fought for him when he was too afraid to fight for himself. When they finally pulled apart, James was grinning from ear to ear. Well, it is about damn time, he said. Now, can we please go home? Mama is going to be unbearable when she finds out she was right about everything. The ride back to the ranch felt different from any other trip Caleb had ever taken. Elena rode with him, resting against his chest, and they talked about it all. The fear they had both been carrying, the mistakes they had both made, and the future they were hoping to build with each other. There were no more walls, no more careful distance, just plain honesty, raw and real and healing. Mrs. Hartwell met them at the front door, took one look at their joined hands and Elena's tear-streaked smiling face, and said simply, "Thank heavens. I was about to ride to Denver myself and haul you both back here by the ear to sort out this nonsense." "Your faith in us is touching, Mother," Caleb said with a dry tone. "My faith is in Elena, who has more sense in her pinky finger than you have in your whole hard head." But she pulled Caleb into a fierce hug all the same. "I am proud of you, son, for finally being brave enough to fight for your own happiness." The trial took place 3 weeks later. Morrison had fought their countersuit with every dime he had, but Elena's testimony completely destroyed his case. She sat in the witness box, composed and speaking clear as a bell, and she explained their arrangement with perfect clarity. Two people had entered into a business agreement that gave them both something they needed, And then they went and fell genuinely in love. She presented the contract, went over each condition, and showed how both of them had honored their promises in good faith. "Mr. Morrison wants you to believe we committed fraud," Elena said to the judge. "But the only fraud in this room is his claim that love has to look a certain way to be the real deal. My husband and I found each other under peculiar circumstances. We built our relationship on honesty and mutual respect, and we fell in love despite doing our best to keep things strictly business. That is not fraud. That is the most honest thing either one of us has ever done." The judge sided with them. He not only threw out Morrison's claims, but also ordered him to pay damages for abuse of process, and issued a court order to keep him from any further harassment. It was a complete and total victory. It was crushing and public and just absolutely satisfying. Morrison walked out of that courthouse looking 20 years older. His political buddies were suddenly nowhere to be found, and his reputation for being unbeatable was shattered into a million pieces. Caleb did not feel triumphant, just relieved. The fight was finally over. They had won, and more important than that, they had won it together. "What do we do now?" Elena asked as they left the courthouse, with Caleb's arm wrapped around her waist, and Mrs. Hartwell and James following behind them. "Now?" Caleb stopped and turned to face her directly. "Now we get married. Really married. Not some secret ceremony, not a business arrangement, a real wedding with our family and our friends, where I can stand up in front of everybody who matters and promise to love you for the rest of my life." "We are already married," Elena pointed out, but she was smiling. "We have a legal paper that says so. I want to give you a celebration. I want everyone to know that you chose me, and I am going to spend every single day for the rest of my life proving I was worth that choice." He drew her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Marry me again, Elena. This time with joy instead of fear. This time knowing exactly what we are promising to each other." "Yes," Elena said, laughing and crying all at once. "Yes, I will marry you again as many times as you want, in as many ways as you need, until you finally believe that I am not going anywhere." "I believe it now," Caleb said. "You fought Morrison, you fought me, you fought for us when I was too scared to fight for myself. If that is not proof of forever, I do not know what is." They married again 6 weeks later in the little white chapel where they had attended that first awkward church social. Half the territory showed up, curious to see the couple whose love story, which had started so strangely, had defeated the powerful Senator Morrison. Elena wore a dress she had made herself out of ivory silk with tiny pearl buttons, and it was simple and elegant and just perfect. Caleb wore his best suit and looked at her like she was the only star in the whole night sky. When the minister asked if he took Elena to be his wife, Caleb said, "I do with my whole heart, for as long as we both shall live." When he asked if she took Caleb to be her husband, Elena said, "I do, seeing all his faults clear as day, because I love him anyway." The whole church laughed. Mrs. Hartwell cried. James stood up as the best man and gave a speech about stubborn brothers and the women who were brave enough to love them. They danced in the church hall right after, doing the same waltz they had practiced so many times in the library. But this time, every single step was pure joy instead of a careful performance. "Happy?" Caleb murmured as they swayed to the music. "Terrified," Elena admitted. "But yes, happy. You too?" "Terrified and happy, and so in love with you I can hardly breathe." He kissed her on the temple. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for coming back when I was too stubborn to come get you." "Thank you for finally believing you were worth fighting for," Elena replied. They built their life together after that day. Not perfectly, but with honesty. Caleb still had days when the fear would creep back in, when he would catch himself putting up walls out of old habit. But Elena would call him out on it, gentle but sure, and he would work to tear them back down again. Elena still had her own moments of doubt, wondering if she really belonged in this life, if she was truly enough. But Caleb would just hold her and remind her of all the ways she had changed him, saved him, and made him believe in second chances. They turned the ranch into something new. There were still cattle and land to manage, but there was also a dressmaker's shop in town where Elena trained other women in her craft. She hired young women just like she used to be, desperate and talented and needing a real chance. and she gave them the opportunity she had once needed so badly. 3 years after that first wedding, Elena was sitting in the library where they had once practiced their dancing and told Caleb she was pregnant. He just cried, with actual tears streaming down his face, and he thanked her for giving him everything he ever thought he would never deserve. Their daughter was born in the spring, tiny and perfect, with her father's dark eyes. They named her Adelaide Catherine, honoring the woman who had believed in them both and taking back a name that had once meant only pain. Caleb held his daughter and understood for the very first time what his mother had tried to tell him all those years ago. That love is not about being perfect or never being scared. It's about showing up every single day and choosing to be vulnerable anyway. "She is perfect," he whispered. "She is going to be just as stubborn as you are," Elena said, exhausted but glowing. "Heaven help us," Caleb said, but he was smiling. 5 years turned into 10. Adelaide got some siblings, 2 more daughters, and then finally a son who looked just like his Uncle James. The ranch prospered, and Morrison faded away from politics in complete disgrace. And the story of how Caleb and Elena Hartwell fell in love became the kind of legend that people told at other weddings. It was proof that sometimes the very best love stories start with the worst plans and end with the most incredible courage. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb took Elena back to that spot on the river where he had kissed her in the rain, where she had told him she loved him, and he had been too afraid to say it back. "Back a third time. We will be finished." "I understand." He led her onto the wide veranda of his ranch house. "I will not run again. I promise you that." They stood there for a long moment, the quiet sounds of the ranch around them. "This spot feels familiar," Elena said with a small smile, leaning into his embrace. "This is where you finally stopped being a world-class fool." "I was a spectacular fool," Caleb agreed, a grin touching his own lips. "But you loved me anyway. I loved you because you were worth loving. You just had to see it for yourself." Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased from being handled so many times. It was their original contract, the very document Elena had used to save them. "I kept this," he said. "After all that happened, I just could not bring myself to get rid of it. It felt too important." Elena took it from him, her eyes scanning the terms they had agreed on so long ago. $5,000, a shop in Denver. No romantic feelings, strictly business. She let out a laugh, full of memory and fondness. "We broke nearly every rule in this contract, did not we?" she said. "We honored the ones that mattered," Caleb corrected her softly. "I paid your family's debts. I gave you a shop, just a bit closer to home than Denver. And you got your freedom when the year was up. The freedom to choose to stay, which was the most important part." Elena's finger traced the line that forbade any romantic feelings. "This part was always a lie, was not it?" Caleb said. "I think I was already falling for you the day we wrote it. That rule was not to stop me from having feelings. It was to protect me from ever having to admit them." Elena handed the contract back to him. "What should we do with it now?" Caleb looked down at the paper that had started their whole life together. The business deal that had turned into real love. The lie that had become his greatest truth. He walked to the edge of the porch, tore the paper into small pieces, and let the Texas wind scatter them across the ranch lands. "We do not need it anymore," he said. "We never really did. That contract was just a way for 2 scared people to let their guard down with each other." "Best excuse I ever came up with," Elena said. "Best deal I ever made." Caleb pulled her in close, his arms feeling strong and certain around her. "But it was not the contract that saved us. It was you refusing to let me hide behind a bunch of rules and my own fear. It was you choosing to fight for us when I was too scared to fight for myself. You came back when I had no right to expect you to. You absolutely deserved it," Elena said, her voice firm. "You have always deserved to be loved, Caleb. You just needed somebody stubborn enough to keep on proving it until you finally believed it." "I believe it now," he said. It took me a long while, but I finally believe I am worth loving, that we are worth fighting for, and that happiness is not something I have to earn. It is something I am allowed to just accept when someone offers it with an open heart. They stood there together while the sun went down over the Wyoming plains, painting the whole sky in shades of gold and rose. From inside the house, they could hear their children laughing. Mrs. Hartwell was probably in there organizing something, and life was a tangled mess, and it was complicated, and it was absolutely perfect. "I love you," Caleb said, and the words felt easy now, after so many years of practice. "I love you too," Elena answered, "even when you are being a stubborn mule." "Especially when I am being stubborn," Caleb corrected her. And then he kissed her, as the very last bit of light left the sky. That bargain was made a decade ago, born from desperation and fear. But what grew from that rough start was something neither one of them could have ever seen coming. A love built on plain honesty, made stronger by choice, and kept alive by the daily decision to be brave enough to be open. It was not the perfect love story. It was better than perfect. It was real. And in the end, that was the only thing either of them had ever truly wanted. Someone to be real with. Someone who saw all their jagged edges and decided to stay anyway. Someone who understood that love was not about dodging pain, but about having a partner to face it with. Caleb Hartwell had spent most of his life believing he was not meant to be loved, that showing your heart was a weakness, that walling himself off from hurt was the same as living. Eleanor Cross had spent her years thinking she had to earn her spot in the world, that her worth was measured by what she could do for others, that love was a thing other people got to have while she just got by. Together they had learned that love is not a business deal, or a show you put on, or something you have to be good enough to deserve. Love was a choice you made every single day, through the fear and the joy and everything in between. A choice to show up, to be honest, to trust that letting someone see you, all of you, was worth the risk of getting hurt. They made that choice once in a moment of panic, promising to pretend for a year. They had made it again every day since then, choosing to love for real instead of just being careful. And they would keep on making it for all the years ahead. Not because some contract said they had to, but because they had finally learned that the best things in life come with no strings attached, no rules, and no safety net to tell you how it will all work out. The best things come from being brave enough to love without any guarantees. From taking a chance that seems impossible and making it true. From understanding that sometimes the story you tell the world ends up becoming the truest thing you have ever known. That was their story. It was messy, and it was complicated, and it was beautiful, and it was 100% true. And it was only just getting started. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.